that
Sure,
right now.
yeah.
I might talk about it. I thought.
Are we ready?
Yes.
All right. Good morning. The time is now 9:44 a.m. It is Thursday, October 19th. We are in Sacramento, California, and it is for the California Board of Occupational Therapy meeting. We'd like to welcome all of our guests who are here, and if we could establish a quorum, please.
Jeff?
Present.
Laura?
Present?
Teresa? Present. Denise?
Yes.
Richard?
Yeah, present.
Sharon? Present. Beata is absent.
Thank you. Quorum has been established. Agenda item 15, public comment session for items not on the agenda. We do have public members who are with us. You are not obligated to introduce yourself, but if you'd like to do so, if we could start to the right here in the first row, all you have to do is either nod, stand up, or announce yourself, or just move it to the next person if you're not interested in introducing yourself.
I'll start. Good morning, board. My name is Laura Whelan, I'm an occupational therapist. And I'm Pat Nadagishi, I'm also an occupational therapist.
My name is Chuck Omar, Associate Chief Officer for Health Policy and State Affairs with the American Occupational Therapy Association.
I'm Heather Penley, I'm an occupational therapy student at Sacramento City College.
Ada Boone Curl, OT Assistant and OTA Program Director.
Ivan Altamura, lobbyist with Capital Advocacy, represent AOTA and also Lily Otech.
Sabrina McCarley, Chair, Advocacy and Government Affairs for OTEC.
Hello, I'm Matt Leger. I'm with SEIU UHW. Nice to meet you all.
Phil Buck, with the Public Consumer Affairs.
I'm Don Merrill, I'm with the Division of Apprenticeship Standards.
Thank you, and welcome. Also, what we're going to, do we have any comments from the public other than your introductions at this time for items not on the agenda? All right, seeing that there are none, do we have comments from the board?
Yes, I just have a comment that I'd like to make. This is our last meeting our last board meeting for 2017, and a couple of us are in a grace period year and have not yet been reappointed, or so this may be our last meeting. Jeff Farrow and I, we may be reappointed, but we may not, and so this would be our last opportunity to say thank you very much to the board. It's been great working with. It's been a great pleasure to work with everybody and a great professional experience. And I just wanted to make that statement. You know, if we see you in February, great. But and we'll continue to do some work we have an administrative committee, some work to do before the end of the year. But I just wanted to take this chance because it may be, in case it's the last.
And I too echo Mr. Brookwelter's remarks. I announced yesterday that I was one of the 22 individuals appointed by Department of Consumer Affairs to the Cannabis Advisory Committee. But I've also recently met with the Speaker's Office to discuss reappointment as well. So I hopefully will be reappointed at the February meeting. But if not, again, it's been a great pleasure working with all of you, working on behalf of the consumers in the state of California, and doing what we can to grow this occupation safely and effectively. And we have an aging population and we have a decreasing pool of providers, and we need to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that our populations get what they need. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to item number 16, presentation by Donald Merrill, Area Administrator, Division of Apprenticeship. Welcome, Mr. Merrill.
What would you folks like?
Where
Here?
you're comfortable.
There?
Come on in, Mr. Merrill.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Don.
I'm not a real polished person, so please bear with me. I brought two handouts. I originally was going to do a small PowerPoint presentation, and I felt it would be better to kind of keep this simple because I don't quite understand exactly what you folks want to do, and so I want to try to paint a broad brush strokes of what apprenticeship is and how you folks may look at methods of implementing it into your trades. So I have two handouts. One, the front page is apprenticeship. It's to kind of give a refresher on the base word of apprentice and apprenticeship. We've lost sight over the last 200 years of what apprenticeship is, and part of that is in the second page where it talks about analogies of universities and professional development. What we've lost sight of is that our university system, our college system, was based on the apprenticeship model from years and years and years ago. And somehow or another, we've developed an attitude as a society that somehow an apprenticeship education is a second-class education when our master's degrees, our baccalaureate degrees, were all based on the apprenticeship model. So I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. The second handout that I brought is the 3 active medical apprentice programs that are currently registered with the Division of Apprenticeship. The oldest is the psychiatric technicians. I wrote that program in 2004. Of all of our apprentice programs, this program consistently has the highest graduation rate. They're running in the high 90% graduation. So that means every 100 apprentices that they register, over 90 of them graduate, get their psychiatric technician certificates. They basically have a very easy or a low entry level to come into the program, and a very strenuous, just under 2-year long program of education. Their employer pays while they're doing their related supplemental instruction. And let me back up. The apprenticeship model has legislated since the 30s, requires 2 components. It requires related supplemental instruction, bookwork, with on-the-job training. The difference between the on-the-job training and an apprenticeship and an internship is the on-the-job training and an apprenticeship is broken down to specific work processes. Now, through the process of creating standards, that's where the professionals come in with my staff, and we help them develop a outline of what actually needs to be taught. So the individual work processes are broken down to every little component, and then the hours are agreed upon by the stakeholders. So the related supplemental instruction for the psychiatric technician, it has a huge portion that's paid for by the employer. Now, that related supplemental instruction includes what they call clinicals. So part of the work on the floor that the apprentices are doing is part of that related supplemental instruction. So it's very, very structured. They're required to have a CNA certificate within the first year, and if they don't make that benchmark, they're held back. They have a very rigorous support system, so if any of the students are in need of help, they furnish that. The Kaiser Permanente program has never really taken off well. I couldn't tell you why. The employer has asked that program remain active, so there's a need there. And then the last one is our newest one, which is the California Correctional Health Care. The last report I got on this was 30 of the expected 50 apprentices have already completed their related supplemental work, and the only thing left is for them to complete their work processes, for them to move from LVN to RN. The reason I didn't bring PowerPoint or an outline is because every apprentice program is different. The stakeholders tell my staff, because we don't know how to build a house to do an occupational therapist's job. We don't know that. We count on the stakeholders, usually labor and management jointly, telling us what it takes. We might go to boards like yours to seek verification that the requirements that they want to establish in their apprentice program is going to lead to a license. Under Consumer Affairs, there's numerous occupations. The one that we lovingly deal with the most is the barber cosmetologist. And what they've done is they've created a apprenticeship license. So it's a, for lack of a better word, a learner's permit that the board allows for, and that was legislated. So there's two paths for a person to become a barber cosmetologist in California. They can go through a strictly educational system where they get some of the work processes in a shop that might solicit the public to come in for a reduced amount for their haircuts and so forth. Or they can get an apprenticeship license. With an apprenticeship license, they attend classes regularly, and then they work at a shop under the direction of a professional that guides them through all of the different work processes. It's what we refer to as an earn while you learn process. I've kind of give you guys a broad strokes of what it is. The Division of Apprenticeship Standards is the state agency that fosters, protects, and promotes apprenticeship. In our statutes, and I can quote them for you if you want, and I have them back in my roll-around briefcase if you guys want to know the exact verse and everything. But most of our stuff is in the California Code of Regulations, Title 8. In California, if your apprentice is not registered with the Division of Apprenticeship, they are not an apprentice. And there's some legal ramifications. In the medical industry, we've never had occasion to take folks to court. That usually happens in the construction industry. And we've won every case that we were challenged on another entity or a private party trying to claim jurisdiction in California. And that includes the Bureau of Apprenticeship, which is the federal sister organization that we are, thank God, starting to get back in step with. We've had a rough 8 or 9 years where we were both trying to go our own ways, and now we're starting to get back in sync with each other again. So I'm open for questions. You guys have me until you're tired of me or lunchtime comes, because I get very hungry and I don't want to gnaw on the tablecloth.
Mr. Miller, where's the primary
You do,
source
it's
of,
in front of that.
where's the primary source of funding from the Earning Your Learn program?
The primary source of funding is generally employer or employee based on a training fund contribution, okay? Now that's more private sector than public. On the public aspect, the California Community College Chancellor's Office administers just under, I want to say, $35 million a year that's called Related Supplemental Instruction Funds. That money is roughly $5 an hour per seat hour for related supplemental instruction, okay? Along with that, there's now, in the last three years, there's been a huge increase in interest by this administration, and our governor has put out roughly, this is the third year, $25 million a year in California Apprenticeship Initiative grants. Later this afternoon, the pre-apprenticeship and on-the-job training grant that was announced, I want to say 2 weeks ago. There's a bidders conference later this afternoon, and there was $7 million that is being allotted, up to $500,000 per award for pre-apprenticeship and registered on-the-job training. And just to kind of do some more loose definitions, in regulation, apprenticeship takes 2,000 hours or more to be an apprenticeable occupation. So there's a little bit of wiggle room, because the prerequisites to qualify for an apprenticeship could be included in the entry level. So if a program, if you look at the California Correctional Healthcare Services apprenticeship, they're taking into consideration that you have to be an LVN to get into the program. So they're giving credit of, let's see, I think it's
1530.
Yeah. So they're crediting that LVN toward the RN completion. So it's an additive, so it's stackable certificates versus you have to meet this benchmark or not. So the 2,000 hours is flexible. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Merrill, if I can at this time, you provided a wealth of information and we want to continue the question and answers, but if we could just step back so that I can point the audience to section 17 of their, Jody, do we have an extra handout that we could give Mr. Merrill, at least section 17, so he knows what we're referencing?
You can share mine with
Or share with,
I
yeah.
can share mine with him, Jody.
We just want to take a moment so that the audience understands why we began this dialogue to begin with. It was raised as a discussion on workforce development, suggested by a board member, and then executed by our executive director so that we would prepare and come forth with this for our board meeting. Do you want to add? Do you want to say more in detail?
Yes, if, for those of you who might not know, the concern about the lack of available fieldwork sites, the challenges the schools have in placing the students in their fieldwork, which is obviously, a requirement for both graduation as well as, to take and pass the licensure exam.
Thank you.
And with the addition of new schools,
That's
this
out
has
of this.
increased the challenges that are out there. So while Jeff Farrow's the one who actually had suggested it, I just kind of want to give a little background because I feel like people are more familiar with apprenticeships in terms of like maybe construction trades. And so in asking Mr. Merrill to come here today to talk a little bit about the apprenticeship, I was hoping that the board would get enough information that they could decide if, yes, this is something we would like to pilot. Under item 17, there is a background material, and I think one of the things that, in speaking with the people that I've spoke with about this, is that I understand that it's different, and I understand that the educators use a set of terminology that differs from the terminology that is used in the apprenticeship world. If the board were to go down this path, one of the reasons I asked that they look into it is because a number of variables, including the saturation of the fieldwork sites and the challenges of acquiring additional, as you know, especially some of the new schools have already moved from 3 cohorts to 4 cohorts per year, for example, which is further exacerbating that problem of, you know, the student placement. Additionally, there was an issue raised where some of the employers, due to the loss of productivity for having students and their sort of like out-of-pocket cost, some of the large employers are wanting the schools to pay them for placing their students. And some educational institutions can do that and some cannot. So that's another variable. And so with the recent passage of AB 2105, which requires DCA to look at the earn and learn or apprenticeship availability for the healthcare professions, I feel that the time is right and that it's appropriate that the board take a look at this. And as mentioned about the, you know, the 2,000 hours and the OTAs, I think complete 960 hours of field work, I think. But to the point that if the board did want to move forward in this regard, I feel like, because one, legislation would be required, but two, that would also be the opportunity to meet both the statutory apprenticeship requirements while melding it specific to the occupational therapy assistant fieldwork requirement. So that's what I wanted to share. Is that helpful?
And then if I can just add to that, later on coming up in the agenda is the executive director's report, but if you look at the projections in that report of OTAs coming out of school, and what was supposed to happen by 2024, we've already met that number and we're at 2017 and exceeded it. So that tells you that if we've gone from 3 schools to 8 schools, that they are coming out at 3 times more capacity than we have before. And so it really makes sense for us to analyze this and discuss as a board.
I was remiss, I also missed a major continuing funding. The Workforce Investment Act was reauthorized, and it's now called the Workforce Investment and Innovation Act, and I could have my words crossed over. And in the old Workforce Investment Act, the word apprenticeship was in the 400 and some pages 2 times. It's now in the WIOA Act more than 157 times. And of all of the, okay, let me back up. Workforce Investment Agency now covers EDD, the Department of Industrial Relations, California Workforce Investment Board, and the Employment Training Panel. So all of those stakeholders, partners, agencies are working to cross-pollinate and work together. So with that said, of all of the educational or performance requirements for WIOA, the only educational model that is exempted from the high standards is the apprenticeship model. All other models have to, I believe it's 68% of their clients have to complete. And that's pretty hard when you're talking about multi-year educational systems.
What would a pilot program look like?
Currently, the best pilot programs are using one of the California apprenticeship grants, or they're hooking up with Workforce Investment Board money. First thing we look for is identifying the, we call them program sponsors. So there's 3 types of program sponsors that we recognize statutely. Single plant, that could be a single facility. And then joint apprenticeship, which is a combination of labor and management. And then the final system is what we refer to as a unilateral sponsorship. Unilateral sponsorship used to be just labor organizations because the employers didn't want to participate. Now what has happened is it's became just employer associations. So some employer associations have no organized labor affiliation, and they want to use the apprenticeship model, so they do it on their own. So we identify program sponsors. We assign a consultant. We have 6 offices throughout the state. I have currently about 35 field staff. We assign a consultant to work with the program sponsors. The best models right now, the best pilots right now are getting some startup funding, usually through the California Apprenticeship Initiatives. That's tied to what we call a local education agency. Heather gave me a list. I didn't duplicate it or anything, but she's aware of quite a few local education agencies that are either affiliated with the occupational therapy trade or have been involved in some way or another.
Actually, my knowledge regarding this is just that that's how the funding.
Okay.
So but I do believe that there are already LEAs that, utilize occupational therapy assistants. So I feel like the coordination with them and the community colleges.
They
is-
act as the physical agent for all of the monies coming to an apprentice program. In a startup world, they may be developing curriculum, they may be setting up instructors, getting them qualified to teach, or hiring them, whatever is needed, depending on the capacity that the program is going to develop. We have apprentice programs that have 1 apprentice, and we have 2 apprentice programs that have over 5,000 apprentices. Currently in California, we have 78,000 registered apprentices.
If I may share also, one of the things when I was first learning about the apprenticeship and the discussion surrounding developing the curriculum and what that would look like, because the ACOT guidelines, sorry for your information, Accreditation Council on Occupational Therapy Education,
Okay.
because the ACOT guidelines already tell the schools the curriculum must contain these components, and then the schools have the flexibility to implement that in different ways. One of the things that I thought was nice is that having this prescriptive document, these guidelines that the schools are already doing, it kind of like fast forwards into this curriculum development. There's just a lot of crossover where I felt like the some of the requirements of the apprenticeship are already available, and that's where I see that if the board wanted to go that direction, that it would perhaps require some like relabeling and terminology. I think I mentioned in the beginning, apprenticeship has terminology, educators have terminology. But that's where I feel that it sounds daunting when you say they have to develop the curriculum and they have to approve the faculty, but that's already in place. And so that's one of, I guess, the nice things that would make this less challenging than if you're trying to start from scratch for something new.
The advantage a group like yourselves have is you have all of these things in place. You know what it takes to make a professional, okay? Most of the time when we develop a program, nobody has a clue of what a standard would be to achieve that. What you're talking about, a lot of times, those are directly correlated to work processes. Even though they may be in a curricula, they're still work processes. And especially when you're talking about and I'm assuming when I say clinical requirements, that is what you guys call it, or is there another label? Okay, that's where either they intern or they go out in an actual work environment trying to actually replicate what they're going to be doing when they become a professional. Yeah, so that's direct correlation.
So Don, I mean, where I see the main stakeholders here that are different than the three, apprentice types is that we have, I think in this situation, you would have associations that, like Ms. Martin talked about, that have already kind of developed the standards and curriculum. You have multiple labor organizations of which represent workers in this. You have obviously employers who are utilizing this, and then you have this quasi interest in the government, right? And I think that so I mean, how does that fit in the current model? Would that fit in one of the current ones that you have, or how would they fit?
It would become a hybrid, probably. See, let me go back to a construction craft that we developed this same issue with, and that's the elevator constructors and the elevator inspectors. So the people that make sure our elevators are safe mostly are municipal, state, county employees. Well, all of that trade were stakeholders, but some of those folks did not want to participate in the apprentice program. So they were left in the parking lot, and the stakeholders created a mix of private and public entities that became the stakeholders. They became we call them program sponsors. The program sponsors are who we go to and who the law goes to when there's any kind of dispute or a need for arbitration. It's the stakeholders that vote that, whether they go left, right, or just mark time. So we're getting more and more hybrids. We have multi-union joint programs that have multi-unions. We have multi-employer association programs that they have their own association of merit shop is what they like to call themselves. Merit shop employers, and they've grown pretty big. So there's all these different models and that's why I didn't bring, graphs and how to do it and what the requirements are, because no two apprentice programs are the same. You can have exactly the same program sponsors, one in one county and the sister county, another group. All the players are the same, and they will be different apprentice programs, even if they have the same on-the-job training hours and the same related supplemental instruction hours, because we have industry-wide standards that can be imposed upon the entire state by stakeholders, by being the professionals and saying, hey, this is the minimum, and legislation can be generated to make those a base requirement statewide.
And then I have one other piece, because, for example, we have people here that are with private educational institutions that wouldn't typically fall under the community college structure that the RSI money and the grant money could flow through. But they can partner with a, so say for example, I'll use Loma Linda. We have a board member who's at the University of Loma Linda.
Okay.
They have a program that's been around a very long time, one of the top. We also have a person from a community college here, one of the directors of that program. How would they, just so that way people know that it can happen, how would Loma Linda find a partner within the community college system to be able to continue to provide the education and graduation of OTAs, say for example?
The simplest way I know of is to be a subcontractor, okay? So the physical agent passes the funding through their physical responsibility, and then an apportionment of that $5 an hour, roughly $5 an hour RSI funds would go to the provider of the education. In this case, I think what you're telling me is there's a private entity that would be the provider. Okay.
Could be one of many, yes.
Well, and those are the kinds of things that we try to advise, my staff try to advise, but we don't get into the nuts and bolts of trying to tell people, what kind of contracts. Generally, if a local education agency is doing nothing but collecting the classroom hours, turning it into the chancellor's office, getting the money, and then passing that money to the apprentice program. Generally, they charge, the best deal is about 15%. You can get a little bit better if you have a lot of numbers, but usually it's about 15% they're going to want to keep for administrative cost before they pass the remainder to the program, and then the program would act as the hiring agent, whether they need a director or a coordinator or training staff or multiple training sites. I mean, we have programs that have 15 and 20 different training sites throughout the state. So it can be made to fit anything.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Yes, please.
So, thanks, Mr. Brown. So one of the, you mentioned that it's a 2,000 hours plus is a apprenticeable field. That includes both the on-job training and the classroom time?
When you read the legislation, it says 2,000 hours on-the-job training, 144 hours related supplemental instruction.
2,000 OJT?
OJT, 144 RSI.
So, because currently we have a field work that's for OT, the OT practitioners is about minimum of 960 hours. And then plus that's just level 2, and then level 1 usually mine was 80 hours, but there's no specific requirement for that. So it adds up to, a little over 1,000 hours, but doesn't, it's under 2,000.
So what are the
But there's a lot of-
prerequisites
But there's a lot of,
to get there?
oh, that's true, volunteer work is a prerequisite in some cases prior to getting into the OT program.
But you have to have.
And there are a lot of classroom hours.
So what we're discussing now is the section of an apprenticeship standard that we call selection procedures. And both federally and state, there is sections that allow for granting of previous credit. Okay? We are not the professionals. It would be the program or the stakeholders that would decide this is acceptable credit. So if a person did a related work and you wanted to accept that toward this credit, okay, that could be done. If we could not come up with sufficient hours for the chief to say, yeah, I like this and I'm going to sign off, and that's what's happened with the ones that I've shown you, then it could still be registered as a registered on-the-job training, okay? So anything less than 2,000 hours that exceeds 3 months in duration, we can also register,
Oh, yeah, definitely exceeds.
okay? And so people don't think of that, but I've been pushing it for 30 years because a lot of people, they may, and let's use the culinary trade to pick on them because it's heading toward lunchtime.
The mind drifts towards.
A chef needs to know what it means to be a dishwasher. And maybe a dishwasher doesn't want to be more than a dishwasher. So we should include those in the steps of going up their education. And maybe after a year of being a dishwasher, they no longer want to be a dishwasher and they want to move up and they want to do service, or they want to become a prep cook or one of the other steps. I've been an advocate, and I'm finally getting some traction, that on-the-job training certificates fit what the industry, educational industry now calls stackable certificates. So you can have a certificate for a registered dishwasher, and it may not lead that person into the culinary industry, but another field may want to accept those 3 months of registered training, has maybe not 3 months, but some credit toward their requirements, so that a person doesn't have to do the whole 2, 3, 7, 8, 15 years of training. They get some credit for what they've done.
Okay, now I have another question that's maybe related. So you mentioned that, I'm familiar with apprentice programs. They're quite structured. Week 1 is this work process, week 2, you learn this work process, and it's more structured perhaps, probably than like we said, we have more leeway in our current training programs for different schools, different like different hospitals, different school districts, to have a different process on the ground. And I think the apprenticeships are more structured than that, typically.
It depends on the needs, really, it depends on the needs of the employer. Because without employers, you're never going to have apprentices, because that's where they're going to get that work hour. And we develop, or we help you develop these work processes, and you don't do work process A in week A or week 1. You might work 2 hours in that work process A that first week, and you might jump up to Z or whatever. We have some methodology that we help people with to track what's being done by that worker, what different work process. And then the check and balance is the supervisor has to sign off on it. The apprenticeship committee has to maintain those records and verify that Don the apprentice, he's already done all 500 work hours of this one type of thing. And so the employer needs to quit making Don do that thing over and over and over again, because that was the amount that he was supposed to do. And if the employer won't move them on, then the committee moves them to a different employer, so they become a completely rounded worker.
Okay, well, that doesn't sound too far different.
So, yeah, so.
There's one more question.
Go ahead.
If I could ask one more question. So you mentioned earlier that there were some jurisdiction, and I wasn't quite clear on what that was, some jurisdiction issues with outside California, that you'd won some disputes about jurisdiction.
There was a dispute about 10 or 12 years ago between the building trades and the Department of Labor. And California is currently the only state that's derecognized or not recognized by the Department of Labor for apprenticeship. Now that has changed over the last 2 or 3 years. We've received 2 grants from the DOL now. And there's dialogue, because the problem is not in all of the other apprenticeship, which is the majority of the apprentices in California. The dialogue problem, and it was a court case, it went to 9th District Federal, is with the building trades and a perception that non-signatory employers were excluded, okay? We don't have that problem outside of the building trades. So there's been some methodology being taken place to heal those wounds, okay? The federal government has changed quite a bit in their vision for apprenticeship, and one of the unfortunate things is they don't have staffing and they don't have funding. So they don't have any way of, other than the few grants that the Obama administration let for apprentices. There's no funding to help train the kids, supplement any costs the employers might be bearing. Where California is more robust than any 3 other states in the United States. We have more apprentices in California than any 3 other states. We have the funding through the community college system. We have funding through the workforce investment boards. We have funding through the employment training panel. And so there's always new schemes coming up to try to encourage and help this major problem that we have as a society of kids going to school and coming out with more debt than they're ever going to be able to pay off. And so, I mean, that's why I do what I do. I mean, this is my 5th pension I'm working on. So I don't just do this because it's my job, it's my vocation. I believe in this.
Well, so we have a national organization that sets the accreditation standards, and we talk about that. We have that sort of structure in place that could be, could be a head start in creating a structure for an apprenticeship. Then, what happens if that? I mean, I don't know if you have any other situation like this. What happens if the national organization changes its requirements or adds to them, and then they come out of alignment?
Well, what we do quite a bit with the federal government, the Office of Apprenticeship, what we do is what we call parallel apprenticeship. So we have a one form that they use or we use so that programs are automatically hooked up at a national level. Whether it's a federal apprenticeship, state apprenticeship, or joint, both of them, there's always systems to modify the standard as needed. Sometimes occupations might be renamed. Sometimes they might be broken into more refined groups. Okay, when I was looking on you guys' website, I seen that you guys also have a licensure for limited permits. I don't know how that fits, but I mean that would definitely be a gateway for an on-the-job training. And it's a way for an employer to see who is dedicated and who isn't. Okay, so we have this structure that we have to go through, and I don't know, because I mean I spent hours on you guys' website. I could not find the 960 hours that you guys gave me like that, and
I was just, actually, that's my math. I could be wrong, but I was sitting here knocking it out.
Yeah.
On my little pad,
So I mean, it's way outside of my expertise. Okay, I mean, I'm an apprentice bureaucrat, and I hope that when I get my journeyman certificate, it comes with a pension. That's what I hope. Okay.
Did you have another comment?
Well, I just was going to have him speak to, the 900 hours. Do you believe that part of that 900 hours is related to people doing it voluntarily, but if they were being paid in some way, that they may be able to do the 2,000 hours?
I'm pulling that from the 24 weeks
Okay.
For OTs, and then there's a 16-week for OTAs for the level 2 field work. And I was just looking at level 1. It says technically there's not a set time for level 1, but usually I did 80 hours at level 1. A lot of people
Right,
do.
I did too.
Most people, that's sort of but it's not a requirement, but it's part of it usually.
Right.
And so that adds up to 1,040 hours
Okay.
for OTs, and then 640 hours for OTAs. But then, so the question is, what other qualifying activities are part of the education program that we do, which is quite expensive as well.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah, so that was.
Well, there's a lot of
That was where I
classroom
was
hours to
coming
get to
from.
where
Right.
they're at
Yeah,
before
there's
they.
And
probably
then a
more
lot of people
classroom
do
hours.
a couple hundred hours, or 100 hours or so to get into the class, to get into the program to begin with, volunteering in a hospital or
Here's
school or something.
here's the main thing we have to look at. There's it's called the ONET, which is online. This is put out by the federal government. It's
I wrote
a
that.
number that, in this case, it's for occupational therapists. We go back to toward the bottom of them discussing the trade. There's a code. It's called specific vocational preparation. So we're limited on what an apprenticeable occupation is by what they put down. So the SVP range for a occupational therapist is an 8 or above. Okay, 4.5, 5 is apprenticeable. So your occupational therapy assistant is an SVP range of 6 to 7.
Okay.
So I'm confident that you guys are recognizable as an apprenticeable occupation. So everything else is just how does it fit in what you guys need. And when I say you guys, I'm talking your industry. So that's the number one thing. When we have a brand-new occupation or an occupation that has an SVP of less, then what we have to do is we have to argue with the Department of Labor to get them to believe that this is an apprenticeable occupation. And truck drivers is a perfect example, okay? In the eyes of the federal government, it only takes 3 months from not ever being in a truck to being a qualified truck driver, okay?
Wow.
And so they don't feel that that's an apprenticeable occupation. Well, we've fought with the Teamsters to get certain segments of their industry apprenticized, because just about all of their drivers have been driving a car for years and years and years to get those skill sets necessary to get into a big truck. And I don't know of a single person ever, and my father-in-law was the president of the Teamsters in the Bay Area. I don't know a single Teamster that was able to become a licensed truck driver in less than a year. You know, so I mean, there's a
Disconnect.
spread.
Another-
We have a
one
couple
last-
more questions from the board.
I can spend another couple things, but one that's really, I think, important, especially to our audience, is the idea of reciprocity. They use a different term in occupational therapy, where somebody gets licensed in one state and being able to have, you know, there's a big move to be able to have transferability, right? And so, can you talk to how there are states that have reciprocity, that recognize the training of one state, and then if a person should move to another state, that prior education and training and work experience is transferable?
When the apprentice model is used, I'm not aware of a single instance that reciprocity was denied, okay? So whether you're using my dishwasher model, which is not apprenticeable, but still an occupation that had a certificate, or an advanced surgeon, if you went through this apprenticeship model, it's accepted worldwide. I've never seen an instance where it was not accepted. We get requests weekly from around the world, people trying to get their completion certificate or a copy or a letter that they completed a apprenticeship in California, so that they could use it to verify employability in another job. And regardless of the TTAW that we had with the federal government, that did not weaken the level that California's apprenticeship is measured by the rest of the nation. We are a front runner. We belong to a large organization that is made up of all the directors of every state's apprenticeship program. And that's where this is all outside of who's in office today or not. That's where what you're talking about, Jeff, that's where that all comes together. Everybody recognizes everybody's standard. In some instances, it's unfortunate, but your occupational therapy assistant would qualify as their occupational therapist in some areas, okay? So some states, their acceptable level of professionalism is so much lower than California's that it's a slam dunk what I think you're talking about. Now, there's supposed to be national standards,
He means
but
from
some
an
states
apprenticeship.
lower that bar
From an
quite a bit.
apprenticeship.
Right. From an apprenticeship.
Do Laura, Teresa, Sharon, Jeff, Richard? Okay. I want to open it to the public a little bit before you get too hungry, Mr.
You look
Merrill,
pretty
but I do want to just, if I can, just direct it so the public knows a little bit about where as we're taking in all these comments and as we hear the public comments, what is before the board is that if we want to consider, the action at the end of all this is if we want to consider moving forward with a pilot program. And if we want to consider, then today's action would be really brainstorming on an ad hoc committee to help us get there. So that's sort of the thought process. With that being said, do we have comments from the public? Who wants to go first? Ada put her hand up first, so Ada, is it okay for the purposes of being videotaped? Does the public mind coming? Do you mind?
Can you move a chair right here,
Can we
please?
move a chair right up here so that we can, maybe right next to the side of the table?
Turn it.
Oh, go.
More like this.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Hello. Good morning. My name is Ada Boone-Curl. I am the program director for the OT Assistant Program at Sacramento City College. Feverishly taking notes, I ended up with a few questions, but making them in terms of remarks as well. In the comment regarding the level 2 field work hours for the OT assistant, we currently have the 640 hours, and in the proposed new standards, we are going to be, if passed, limited at 40 hours. So I'm back there trying to feverishly come to the 3,000 hours. And it's my understanding that I heard that there were mechanisms for alternate pathways if we did not meet the 2,000 hours. And one of those was on-the-job training, and that was greater than 3 months, but less than 2,000 hours. And but our level 2 field work is just shy of or right at 3 months. So as I expressed a concern, looking at the logistics of how we actually do meet the parameters. The other, so I may ask a question for clarification. Is it okay?
However you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. The $5 per hour seat hour, that, and based on that collection of funds, that goes strictly to the employer providing the apprenticeship. Is that a correct statement?
No. No, it's paid to the program or through the LEA for the related supplemental instruction.
Thank you. Which leads then to just pointing out something to put on the table for further consideration, if so chosen to do so, is a concern from an educator's perspective, is the increased workload that will happen as a result of establishing and maintaining contracts, and that cost being borne by the district or the local education agency to increase its administrative role. So I would like to recommend that be added as a list of considerations of how we as a district would need then to increase that workload and increase our contract and otherwise paper management, because we already have a separate set of contract and paper management as it relates to establishing contracts with work sites under our current system. And so this would then add another layer of contracting that is a separate process. And did I hear correctly that there are mechanisms of when our standards change from our accrediting agencies? There's ways that we go back and modify
Yes.
the standards that are required to the specific work processes that were referenced. That's okay.
That keeps my staff in work.
Okay, well, I think we can contribute. Thank you.
We also, if there's a change in standard wages or minimum wages, those are things that get changed very, very commonly. Every time that there's a minimum wage increase, those programs that start at minimum wage need to identify those kinds of things. One other thing you mentioned on funding for employers, some of the other partners do have funding methods to help the employers and that would be the workforce investment boards and the employment training panel. The employment training panel, I believe, don't hold me to this, but I think they give roughly $12 an hour. And what it is I think they have a $17 an hour amount that if you were not an apprenticeable, or not in an apprentice program, an employer could get $17. They take away that $5 an hour so that there's never a suspicion of double dipping, okay? So their cap is $5 less, so that there can never be an amount greater than what they would allow for a non-apprentice program.
Thank you. So overall, as a program director, we know that we're in a definite time of change with new accreditation standards pending on the table that will definitely change how we provide field work and the parameters. I would like to express that from our school's opinion, we do find this to be an interesting model that we would be interested in learning more about pursuing because of the benefit not only to the school and the potential employer, but as a result, it certainly does have an influence on the potential for benefit to the consumer based on a more standardized approach for training, in that we would have to have a certain baseline standard to meet the qualifications. Although driven, we do have some openness in our interpretation of accreditation standards. We would have to standardize our thought process and establish minimums of performance tasks to qualify. So as a program director for Sacramento City College, I would like to express that this does sound like an interesting potential to create a new future, because we're already in the process of creating a new future for fieldwork education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ada. Our next public comment. Chuck, would you?
So again, Chuck Woolmark with the American Occupational Therapy Association. Mr. Merrill, thanks so much for this information. I want to dive into the weeds a little bit. You mentioned ONET. And so coincidentally, a contractor for ONET, RTI, contacted AOTA, which is the national organization, a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted our assistance to help update the ONET profile for occupational therapists. Now, they didn't mention occupational therapy assistants, but I suspect that's the next request. So my question to you is, how much do you and your department, how much do you rely on the ONET profiles to help define the apprenticeships that I think would help us decide how much effort into helping them get them right? Because the existing ONET profiles for occupational therapists and assistants are a little odd. I think if members of the board looked at them and looked at some of the task statements, they said, well, that's a little off. So that's my question, is how much you rely on the profiles.
To nail me down to how much do we rely, I'm going to say 8 to 10%.
Okay.
Okay? Now, what does that mean? Well, you heard me talk about arguing with the federal government to help an industry become apprenticized. Okay? We go by the industry experts on establishing what that occupation is, not the ONET code. The ONET code is a tool that identifies the occupation as being apprenticeable. So we don't have extra paperwork that we have to apply to get the occupation apprenticized, recognized by the federal government as an apprenticeable occupation. Okay? And it's a place for my staff to start a dialogue, because we don't know. I mean, I've been to physical therapists before, okay, and I actually lovingly refer to them as physical terrorists, okay? So I don't know what an occupational therapist is, other than visiting the board's website, reading everything I could on there, and then going to the ONET code and trying to interpret what they look at. And I agree with you, it's pretty sketchy. The task, they list 5 of 16 tasks: complete and maintain necessary records. Well, that's okay. Test and evaluate patients' physical and mental abilities and analyze medical data to determine realistic rehabilitation goals for patients. Train caregivers how to provide for the needs of a patient during and after therapy. Evaluate patients' progress and prepare reports that detail progress. Plan, organize, and conduct occupational therapy programs in hospital, institution, or community settings to help rehabilitate those impaired because of illness, injury, psychological, or developmental problems. Okay. Now that don't, as a layman, that don't tell me a lot, but it sounds pretty dang complex.
Right, okay, well, I appreciate that, and that helps me at sort of the national level, sort of to decide how much really effort to help modify or make suggestions to the contractor that's working on these for Department of Labor to have them make a little bit more sense, because if your folks are going to be using them and the terminology isn't quite right, or the process that we use to deliver therapy isn't articulated well, then it could just sort of reverberate. So thanks for diving into the weeds on that, that's very helpful.
But you folks have a national, I'm going to call it, outline. When we go into most situations like this, there is no guideline. So we're looking at technological skills, and we're trying to talk to an employer that has no concept maybe of educating people. Okay, they just know that they need to have somebody that makes widgets. Okay, they need a widget professional, and so we're using these kinds of tools to help them identify what the educational requirements might need to be, and what the work process is. My opinion, and this is from living this for 40 years, my opinion, the work processes is really where it's at, because so many people don't learn as good reading as they do doing.
I appreciate that, and as I read through the knowledge statements and the task statements and other really detailed information in those profiles, it wasn't cohesive. I didn't get a cohesive picture of occupational therapy, and to the extent that we can help a contractor fix that, that might help on the other side when we're trying to define an apprenticeship.
I didn't see the two of them hooked together real well either.
If I may make a comment, this discussion reminds me of the fact of the electronic medical record skills. I have some colleagues who have a terrible time. They have very poor computer skills, and it sets them back, and it creates a big problem. And those are work process skills to handle the software and all of these that we probably don't. I don't know.
They should be before that 960 hours.
I was just thinking that too.
They really should be.
I completely agree.
And there's a lot of partnerships out there to help you guys verify that they're at that level before they come into your entries.
Okay, well, one more statement before I head back. I think some sort of license, temporary license, limited permit, some sort of recognition by the board of someone that is in an apprenticeship would be really critical. Because I think what we run into currently is fieldwork students don't have a license, right? They're students. So it's very difficult to get reimbursed for their services. So if they have some sort of legal standing, that opens the door to Medicare payment, potentially other payment sources. And so I think that would be a critical component to making this work.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Anybody else? Just the gentleman in the back has had his hand up for a while. And then Sabrina, you'll be next.
So hello, my name is Matt Leger. I work for SEIU UHW, and I do workforce development for the union. We represent over 90,000 healthcare workers, private sector healthcare workers across the state of California. And we were one of the proponents of AB 387, the bill that we talked about yesterday. And I really want to applaud the board for talking about this discussion in particular, because the concern that we had on 387 was licensing has really grown over time and is creating a barrier for people to get into great professions like occupational therapy. And so that bill is really targeted to try to, like, how do we ensure that as people are, doing these hours, that they can afford to do those hours, because not everyone can, afford to volunteer their time. And so to that extent, I want to really applaud and encourage the board to, take a look at apprenticeship. I do think after hearing Mr. Merrill's presentation that occupational therapy assistant in particular is a fantastic candidate for apprenticeship programs. And I want to offer my technical expertise as well, or that of our workers, to help in any way we can. Like I said, the goal of that bill is really to try to make better pathways into the middle class. And apprenticeship is a great way to do that. In that respect, we've actually created 2 apprenticeship programs in private sector healthcare. So one of them was for medical coders, and the other one was for medical assistants. And so, in trying to implement those in the public sector, or in the private sector, excuse me, we've learned quite a bit. And so I'd love to share that knowledge with you all in terms of not recreating the wheel. And then the last thing I just want to touch on is, we've heard, as we were doing that work around 387, we heard a lot about this paid for performance. And we know that that's something that our community colleges just can't compete with. And we know that there's some great schools out there, particularly in the healthcare space, but we also know that there's some schools that really tend to pry on students and people of color who are, want to get in the healthcare field, but they end up leaving school with $25,000 in debt for a degree that's not really meaningful in the workplace, in the workforce. So we'd love to continue the dialogue on the pay for performance as well. So I know that was wide-ranging and not specifically on the topic. I apologize. But in particular, or in summary, I just want to, really encourage the board to, take a deeper look into apprenticeship programs, and happy to provide any expertise we can to do that. So.
I actually have a question for both of you, if I may, Mr. Merrill and Mr. Leger at the same time. Let's just theoretically, let's just say, and I already have legal approval to ask this, so.
Depends on what.
No, I do. I sent a note.
I just said yes.
I sent, and Noreen, if my question isn't what you thought it was, when you gave approval, you can call me out on camera. It's all good. We're just trying to get to a good outcome here, so it's all good. The question is if the board so willed it and we did put together an ad hoc committee, would you find value in you or somebody you designate participating in that? And the question, Mr. Merrill, is would that be of value as well, to have this group participate with our educators?
Most definitely, because I mean, the number one problem that we run into, there is a section in the Code of Regulations that requires input from any labor organization if a labor organization is involved in that industry. Okay, they're not required to be sponsors or anything, but we need to solicit their input. If they're not willing to participate, then we so note that, and we've met our statute requirement. The other thing is, I mean, this is what we're my whole division, this is all we do. We're committed to this. I mean, this is, we're required to do this, and I'm here to tell you that if you guys want to proceed with just exploring it, we will expend the resources necessary to help you in any way we can. Besides your bill identifying us, requiring us to come help you, there's multiple other layers that we are there for you. And if I had $1 for every time we've spent years working on an apprentice program and then everybody decided, no, we don't want to do that, I would already be retired.
Thank you. So, do you have any further questions or comments, Mr.
No.
Lejeune? Okay,
No,
so
I mean, just,
we
I
have
don't
your-
know if you directed that at me as well.
I did.
We'd love to, work with you, and that was, I appreciate the concerns around the bill. And so in that respect, we'd love to work in a real positive way of trying to trying to accomplish the goals of the bill, which is to create pathways into the middle class and into good licensed professions. And we'd love to do that in a positive way with you.
So you're referring to the comments we brought up yesterday regarding the concerns about the bill?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Your comments, but also more broadly other professions' comments that we completely
Great,
agree.
great.
Yeah,
So-
potential collapse of our fieldwork education program.
Absolutely. I mean, that obviously is not the goal of the legislation. The goal of the legislation is to try to create good pathways into the middle class. And so, to that respect, we'd love to partner with you.
Great.
Does UHW represent any occupational therapists?
We do.
Or occupational therapist assistants?
We do.
Because I know IFTPE does, but
Yeah, we do.
most of it. We're in Second California or?
Particularly in Southern California at Kaiser.
There's some UNAC as well, correct? Southern
UNAC
California?
has some as well, yeah.
Who was that?
UNAC, United Nurses of AFSCME affiliate.
Yep.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
comments. Thanks for, further public comments? Sabrina?
Hi, I'm Sabrina McCarley. Just a couple of, I guess, remarks or clarification. As Ada had mentioned, going through with this apprenticeship would add an administrative cost to Sacramento City College. But I'm still, from a employer standpoint, how does this incentivize the employer? Because we still have the issue of employers taking the fieldwork students, that's still there. So the school, unless I'm misunderstanding, the school will get an incentive financially. And then they still have to work with different employers, correct, for the placement. Because there's no incentive for the employers. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying, and I guess maybe I wasn't clear. The local education agency, the school, they're the physical agent, but they pass the money
Right.
minus their administration
Okay,
costs
that's what we were.
to the program sponsors. Then the program sponsors take that money and then they make financial decisions on how that money is utilized. The money's not designed necessarily to pay an employer, but it could be used to pay a vendor or a subcontractor for their learning work that they're doing toward the student, okay? For funding, an employer would go to either the Workforce Investment Board or the Employment Training Panel, okay? So that's a secondary funding, and by virtue of having a state registered apprentice program, those funding doors are only open to apprenticeship.
Okay, so with that, I would just ask that the board take into consideration that, you know, in the post-acute care world, we are all 30 days from losing a contract. So you can switch out every 30 days. So if there's any leniency in that. So in skilled nursing facility A, for example, you could start it off and it's rehab agency A, and 30 days later it could be rehab agency B. So you could be dealing with completely different people every 30 days. It's not that drastic, but it could be. There is all the shift around with that. So I just,
See, those would be things that you would develop inside your standards. Your program sponsors would, I mean, we have mechanisms. One of the mechanisms that we have is what we call an agreement to train apprentices. So you can bring in new employers with that one-page agreement, and it ties them to the standard that the program sponsors have created. So you can change your I'm going to use the word
Similar, like going
vendor,
through field work
but you could change
sites.
your employer
Right.
quickly if necessary.
Okay, and
Let me answer one more piece about your funding stream. And I think we've heard it loud and clear. Chuck mentioned it up there, is that, you know, again, we're looking at how we do this, and that maybe there is a license type for apprentice that would allow billing, which would allow the employer to be reimbursed, which would incentivize also having apprentices, right? So, I mean, we're not saying you're gonna come and take the model that currently works. We're saying that we're willing to work, at least the way we're investigating it, is that we know that we would have to find a process that works and how we do that. And I think it's been loud and clear 2 days in a row now that the not being reimbursed, where a lot of other industries, you know, they see immediate value to having an apprentice by not being able to get reimbursed for the work that's done. Let's say construction trades at the end of the day, when a building is built, the contractor is paid for the time that was spent building it, right? All the work is paid for. There was a contract that was built based upon the employer's estimated labor costs. It was accepted, everybody gets paid, the work was paid. Healthcare is a little different, right? So we have to figure out how we structure this in a way where these people doing the work, if we're going to design it that way, the employer could get billed, there could be additional money through employee training panels that will help, you know, cover more than what would necessarily be billed, and then figure out a way to get in classroom to incentivize educators to stay and participate in this process, is what I think we as a group and what the ad hoc, if we choose to do so, would be looking at. And that's why we need multiple kinds of people to volunteer and participate in it. Because if we don't hear one group's concern, then we can't address that concern. So that would be my response to some of that.
so with that, I just want to echo from yesterday, and, you know, as you said, we've heard loud and clear, but the other part of that is, you know, it's a pass-fail when we're dealing with such medically complex patients, and when we add that dynamic that it's our employee and we have to pass or fail them, that becomes another dynamic in it. So I just, again, would like to echo that from my comments yesterday.
Thank you. Any further comments? Come on back.
Again, Ada Boone-Hurl, Sacramento City College Program Director. As the board decides to pursue the conversation, I would like to make a recommendation that on the list of topics reviewed is that we discuss how this will apply to schools that are accredited in other states, providing field work and other clinical services within the state of California, and how those oversight parameters and inclusion, exclusion, et cetera, is affected by that educational model. Thank you.
Well, that raises a question. Do people from outside California come in and participate in the California internship programs?
And then go back to their state afterwards?
Yes, and I guess I'm a little bit at loss here. It sounds like currently folks from outside of California come to get their clinical hours here, and that's kind of chewing up you folks' bank of hours with no control
Available.
over that?
Available placement sites.
Okay, so, I mean, to me, the perfect solution to that is to require registration in an apprentice program. Probably our most successful, to answer your question, is the Caterpillar Corporation. They require their heavy-duty mechanic technicians to not only come to California, but they have to spend 2 years here in their apprentice program. They are spread out amongst all of California through the employers that lease and use Caterpillar equipment and have these technicians. They're required to also complete an associate degree before they're allowed to graduate. And then as soon as they graduate, they go all around the whole world. So yes, folks come here, but they have to register as apprentices here before they're allowed to access the California funding, training, that it sounds like you guys are furnishing for other states?
Or we could, states can go, all the schools, you can go anywhere in the states to do a field work, as long as there's a contract, an existing contract. So even students from California can go to other states and do their field work opportunities, and then come back to work. It's kind of exposing them to a wealth range of.
Can you?
You know, I would just have to understand it more, but it just seems counterintuitive to me that you folks are having trouble finding enough clinical hours, and they're not all being used by Californians.
That's why we couldn't do it.
You need to speak up.
Sharon, we need to turn the mic towards you if you're going to speak, and then we're going to end these comments.
All I was going to say is, our students come from all over the states. So I work at Loma Linda University. I have students from California plus everywhere else. So a lot of times they need to do their fieldwork opportunities back home. And that's some of it, just to share.
I know that you guys could have an apprentice program with the federal government where you could then have that registered apprentice in any state and be able to track that. I don't see, when you leave our state, how you can track that. And so that's my concern. My concern is always, you know, is the program properly protecting those apprentices to make sure that the level is meeting the standard that we've established?
And again,
All
that's a
noted.
consumer.
Can you say one more thing? Mr. Merrill, I can't let you leave here without at least trying to define occupational therapy before you. I would be a horrible advocate during conference to not even try to give you the lowdown, not anything that you're gonna read, and you can read every website and all of our wonderful foundational knowledge definitions, but if I wanna leave you with something that you might remember, and this is just from my humble opinion, but when people ask me what I do, the first thing I say is, I'm a meaning maker, and they're like, what does that mean? In our profession, we use the word occupation to mean roles, habits, and routines, and those things that are important to you. So however they're impacted, an injury, Mr. Shea in the back, I'm like, I know some OTs that can work on that split, and looks a little big for you, I'm just saying. So however those are impacted, you know, if you like playing the guitar and that's impacted from a mental health issue or a hospital issue, our job is to get you back to those things that you love doing. And that way we create meanings. That's my definition.
Well, I need to see your folks because I've been trying to get younger.
We're not miracle
We can work
workers,
together,
but we're
Mr.
close.
We can help with lunch, because some people have trouble eating, so that's one of the things. Since that's the theme of our discussion today.
We can't thank you. Any further public comments before we move on? We want to thank everybody, yourself, Mr. Merrill, for coming. We've been having this dialogue for about a little bit over 90 minutes. It's been a very robust discussion. Do we feel like we have enough depth and breadth to at least propose any sort of motion related to an ad hoc?
I thought that was item 17. Are we concluding item 16? And we kind of went to 17. Did we open, says we went right into 17, so we're in 17. Making sure.
No, we aren't. The outcome of, well, do you want me to hold the action item to 17? I can. If I can hold it.
It's a perfect segue to 17.
Well, we're actually taking a break after
Oh, I see.
16.
That's
So,
why I was asking.
so here's
Okay,
what,
okay.
here's what's going to happen. We'll hold that. There's no problem there. We're going to take a break. The time is 11:13. If we could resume, please, at 11:25.
Did you have any more questions that we might?
All right. Thanks, everybody. We took a little bit longer than anticipated, but not a big deal. The time is 11:33 a.m. We are going to restart the California Board of Occupational Therapy meeting Thursday, October 19th here in Sacramento. And if we could start with item 17, discussion on possibly establishing a pilot apprenticeship program for occupational therapy assistants completing fieldwork as part of an academic program at a community college. Before I turn this over to our executive director, we have already, in a sense, started the discussion about section 17. I again draw the audience's attention to the purpose and the background for why we began the discussion around this apprenticeship program. Further, your handouts include an Assembly Bill 387 introduced by Assemblymember Thurman. Further, there is a Assembly Bill number 2105 introduced by Rodriguez on workforce development specific to allied professionals. So those are your documents. Do you want to queue up anything, or do you feel like we're there, or how should we get into this?
I think you're there unless anyone has any other questions of me personally, but I think you kind of heard a wide range of comments today.
So who wants to discuss? Let's just go with the agenda item and start there. Who wants to weigh in first on the discussion on the possibility of an apprenticeship program?
I'm looking for clarification. So while I enjoyed Mr. Merrill's presentation, I thought it was quite robust and very informative, and I appreciate the audience participation, and it obviously sounds like a very good direction that is not only needed in the industry, but can provide quite a bit of resources and support in a way that we maybe haven't had in the past. That being said, I'm still a little unclear as to what the expectation is in item 17 for the board's role in moving forward. Is the request for the board to simply establish an ad hoc committee to explore the possibility of such an apprenticeship program and how it would look within the state of California, or is it to in fact establish the program for this purpose? And if so, then going back to the points of administrative costs and so on, what is the expectation of oversight from this board in not only the establishment of the program, the administration of it, and so on. My concern stems from, one, I want to make sure that as a board we're not overstepping our role in this area, and obviously there seems to be quite a bit of interest and support from stakeholders outside of this organization. So I think there's potential to move that forward. Two, considering we just had a recent fee increase to absorb some of our current administrative costs, so I'm looking at going forward, what would be the mechanism of supporting this type of effort going forward? And third, how can we ensure that we are providing equal access to not only all consumers, practitioners, but also to all stakeholders to ensure that the selection of such city colleges or private institutions are well addressed. So that's kind of the gist. So I think my basic question is, do we even have the authority to move forward to establish such a mission or an ambitious target, or is it simply a discussion on what the board would recommend on how to approach it?
Thank you. All good comments and questions. Anybody want to, is there anything legally, Noreen, that you want to answer in response to? Is it in the board scope?
If it is if it focuses on qualifications for licensure and is within the purview of protection of the public, it could potentially be within the board scope. Generally, it is within the purview of the legislature to set the qualifications for licensure, and the board could look at suggestions for statutory changes to that based upon its experience with review of license applications now and its experience with issues in getting the qualifications for licensure satisfied. And it could be it could be a discussion that begins and then gets potentially turned over to the profession if it appears that it is really more of an issue of access to the programs rather than service to the consumers. But it it is not entirely clear to me yet that it is an issue for the board, but certainly a concern and maybe worth at least an additional discussion to determine whether or not it is within the board's purview to say, let's look at some statutory changes in order to protect the public. Does that make sense?
So if, just one. So before I have you, if you feel prepared to speak on cost, I would just want to address in a very peripheral standpoint the question about equal access. I would imagine if there was some sort of an ad hoc committee to explore this, that there's 8 community colleges, that someone from each of those colleges would be invited. And there would be no discretion on limiting, we're only going to take these 3. They would all be invited equally, and it would be up to them to choose to participate. That's only my thoughts. That's not the will of the board, but that's just to answer the access question. Do you want to say anything generally about cost?
Well, one point of clarification, there's actually 3 community colleges, and the rest are for-profit vocational education institutions. So I did want to make that distinction. In terms of the cost, this would, initially there's not a dollar cost, there's a resource cost to this, and I feel like it's along with any other assignment by the board. It's absorbable, it's something the board goes in this direction, then that's where we do focus time and effort.
So if I can just respond to this again, and then we'll move right into your comment, Mr. Farrell. Irregardless of if they're public or private, I would still imagine we'd provide equal access because as we know from Mr. Merrill, there are different entry points of how they can utilize a program. So thank you for that clarification, but
I didn't mean equal access to the conversation surrounding it, but with the information I provided previously, through the funding of the California community colleges and their close work with the Division of Apprenticeship Standards for the Workforce Investment Act funding and the other various funds. That's why the kind of emphasis was on community colleges.
right, so noted, and we're aware of that, but he also identified entry points for people when the question was asked by Mr. Farrell about private entities. So, okay, that being said,
Well, my vision, if we were to create a ad hoc committee, is really to be the party that creates the table for the conversation, right? I think you have a lot of stakeholders that are going to have either concerns or interest in this process and as a solution to some of the challenges that come before this board. I think the board would continue its role of licensure and enforcement and things of that nature, but I think with that board being proactive and not waiting till we have a crisis, which it's moving that way on field site locations, that we set a table where we have people on there working with community, consumer, educators, and labor, and talking about what do we do now before it becomes a place where we don't have many options, right? And I think the idea, I totally agree that the cost is just like any other ad hoc committee, travel, the time to be there, the staff to staff it. I think the discussion within the committee will deal with how the administrative cost of negotiating those contracts, how the disbursement of funds would be. And then if it looks at the end of the day, that group would probably not be us trying to register an apprenticeship program. It would be that group coming together, working with the state and the agency to request the ability to develop an apprenticeship committee. I would probably see that as being a pilot at first, just so that way it would be very difficult. I think the associations have been in this for very long. It would be very difficult for them to shift completely, just knowing the way people are, to an entirely new way to move workers into the industry and provide patient care. But I think if you started with a pilot that was narrow enough yet broad enough to allow people to see an alternative way, then we could revisit it and see if this is something that would make a better process for everybody, basically.
I tend to agree with Jeff as far as, I think it's just a conversation starter. I think the stakeholders have it's like a needs assessment that we would do. We have to see if there's even a need, if the stakeholders who are the primary recipients of this really want something like this to happen. But I think, as was mentioned today, we're in the midst of change. It's a time to look at innovative ways to become progressive with our profession. So just to start the conversation, invite the vital stakeholders and have them, run this conversation to see if it's even feasible is important to do. So I think our purpose was not to pilot right now, but to just start the conversation by inviting these people, the stakeholders, to start and revisit some options.
And that's the clarity I needed.
Yeah,
Because
so
the
that
line
was my
item specifically says that, the possibility of discussion on possibility of establishing the program. And so that's where I'm like, is that truly the intent of what we're moving
I think
forward?
the intent is really, in terms of the action item that I've listed, it would really be, should we establish an ad hoc committee
discuss it.
to explore this?
And the reason it says possibly doing this is because the board could decide to not go in that direction. So there's no conversation about ad hoc committee, because really the ad hoc committee is only if the board said, yes, let's explore it versus let's shut it down. That's why it's worded that way. It's not presuming.
It seems to me that we could start with a narrower question, because ad hoc committees being what they are, open-ended is not. You have to have a defined
Specific objective.
question between now and the next meeting or the meeting after, whatever. And it seems like the question is, do our regulations allow for an apprenticeship type of license? We have a limited permit. We've talked about this informally before. We have a limited permit. Would that be the same permit that we could use for an apprenticeship? The answer we think is probably not, but wouldn't it be good to have an ad hoc committee look into that
Well, I don't
question
think,
about what?
I'm not trying to close the conversation. I feel
No?
like you should maybe
Start
have
sooner
a
than that?
different. Well, no, because it's not allowable right now, right? Because you
Right.
are not eligible for a limited permit until you've completed your classroom instruction and your field work and you've graduated.
Right.
So that currently is the minimum requirement to get the limited permit. So
You have to change it. So that's
change your question.
I think, I might,
Could the consumer be protected through another type of permit? Or not?
That's a very
That's a good
different question.
Is that,
Yes.
and is that, and what would that look like? And that could be what the ad hoc committee could talk about.
Right. And I would say that, recognizing when I started talking about this as an option, I've had an opportunity to look at the different legislative committees that are established that kind of fall under this, which would be B&P, Labor, Health, all of which have people with multiple committee seats. From looking at that group and the people that I know and looking at what they've been moving already, there would probably be sufficient interest at the Capitol to work with us to explore that and to see if there's a license type that could be created. I can't speak whether they do it or not, but I think that there have been, based upon the bills that have come in front of us to date and the challenges that they've been trying to address with those bills, that we could probably have a conversation once we've had an ad hoc committee that looked at what we would need to do to make that happen.
now, I actually see that further along. I don't see, I think, I'm more inclined to suggest, if we're looking at Mr. Bookwater's suggestion to put together an ad hoc committee with specific questions, I would say, let's open it up to all the OTA programs. Let's task them to match up their curriculum with what is, with the existing apprenticeship program, and to tell us how feasible it is.
Good.
From that point on, this board can decide if this is really in our domain, if there's other stakeholders that we should let take the lead. The outcome of the limited permit, which is very good, and we know that'll take a while to change the language, is definitely something that's in our purview, but we need some people to do some exploratory work for us before we even know if that's feasible.
Right.
So I appreciate and applaud. You guys always get to the end a lot faster, but I think there has to be some exploratory work up front that's more, let's just connect the dots. Let's actually let the program educators come away and tell us, this really matches up, this meets workforce development, this is a feasible avenue. We suggest the board and or other entities continue. That's how simple I see
Sure.
an ad hoc committee being. I don't know.
I might suggest that one of the threshold questions for an ad hoc committee as well is whether or not there is evidence of need for consumers, and that is not being met because of the.
Good point, Noreen. Tying it back into the, yeah,
because
we
of
will.
the lack of licensees that the workforce development is based on consumer need, not anything else. And that might help the board determine whether or not to be on the periphery of the discussion that is more within the purview of the profession versus a more active player, if that helps.
Right. Always tying it back to the consumer. So again, I know we haven't voted and we have public comment, but in the interest of time, in terms of moving this forward, I'm just going to propose something. If the board wants to go in a different direction, just say so. Just stop me if I've gone too fast. Why would it be helpful if we utilize our time together in this discussion and opening up to the public if we were to assume that the exploratory ad hoc was a good idea? Let's just put together the 5 to 7 questions now, establish that committee and move on. Or the themes, I don't mean the exact questions. Or let's also just discuss if we don't want to go in that direction at all.
Well, Doreen has just proposed a couple of questions with the, is there a need for consumers? Is there potential benefit for consumers?
Well, I think, how
Or
does
is it
this
problem?
protect the consumer from the workforce issues? How does our involvement in this type of thing protect our consumers from
It does by
potential?
2 ways, I think, at least 2 ways. One is that it'll provide a greater pool, and it'll create a more diverse pool. And I think that's very important because a lot of people in the health want to be able to relate to their caregiver. And
That's an answer, not a question.
Yeah,
Okay,
we're actually
well,
just.
but I'm just saying, the question is that, the question was, does it have a need? And I said, I think it, yes.
No,
Well, it's a
he's,
great
he's
question.
proposing it as a question for the committee to determine, because we can only assume.
Right.
I think it's nice to have a pool of questions that the ad hoc committee
Correct.
would find relevant to them. And then they
Correct.
could amend their own
They
questions.
can make
We
their own
can't dictate. We don't
determination.
know what their needs
Sure.
are.
So do you want to move in the direction of just coming up with general, and before I direct the board in this manner, is there anybody from the public that wants to have a comment on the direction we're going? It looks like we're going.
I have one.
Can you come up
Sure.
here, Ivan?
You know, good OT for that.
I know, exactly. So, Ivan Altamura of Capital Advocacy. I think maybe this might just be a comment or pointing out something that could help from a directional perspective on what, or at least maybe one element of if the ad hoc committee was to be looking at this. I just draw your attention to the Little Hoover Commission report, the strategies to ease occupational licensing barriers. Under apprenticeship models, it says the legislature will have to adjust occupational practice acts to allow apprenticeships in some occupations, but since many of these occupations already allow or require student practicums, this represents a language change and not a shift in consumer protection. So from the perspective of what changes legislatively would be required for this to be allowed as an apprenticeship in OT or other allied health professions as well? What exactly is what is the Little Hoover Commission referring to as the changes legislatively that might need to be made for this to become a reality? And for the ad hoc committee to be looking at that as one of the elements.
We could go about it that way, or we could also, within a legislative committee that we'll be establishing, we could have them specifically just look at that one question.
Right.
So as not to have the ad hoc committee get caught up on not moving towards a tactical outcome, you know. And if we have a legislative committee, you're welcome to weigh in, Sabrina from OTAC. Whoever is so moved by that particular topic can weigh in. That could be one direction.
Okay.
Or
Well,
we, yeah.
And if there's a Little Hoover Commission language that supports this, it's not really a consumer issue, then we can move to the next question. We could add,
Right.
some more.
Yeah, the recommendation
If
that
that's-
they say in response to that statement is that the state of California should develop interim work and apprenticeship models to provide opportunities for people missing certain qualifications to work while meeting their requirements and to promote upward mobility within career paths.
Right, it sounds like a direct need of the profession.
Right.
And so, you know, as a sideways piece, we're also aware that you as a lobbyist, our national and state associations may or may not be looking at the Practice Act, so this may be an element where you can contribute. That, you know, we'll all get to the end of the World Series as Dodgers. No. You know, we'll get a good outcome.
Right.
So the point being, thank you, Ivan. The point being is that our executive director needs some direction on this. So in terms of bringing us back to getting direction on this and very specific questions, do I pose the question again? Does the board want to start by calling a motion to establish an ad hoc? If so, someone needs to do it. We need to
It needs to have a
vote.
purpose, and so my concern is I am not ready to vote yea or nay on the establishment of an ad hoc without an explicit purpose of the outcome for such committee.
Can you say more about what that outcome might look like, or how you would frame, what type of motion you would
I'm
want to?
just looking, I understand, I think Sharon said it very succinctly, where the establishment of the ad hoc is to determine if there is such a need within the consumer protection for this type of apprenticeship program to fill such need. I mean, that's the exploration, right? And I think right now, and it's been great commentary, but I have seen this is really a professional need. Granted, without this being served for the addition of field work sites, there is an eventual impact to consumers. But as of right now, it sounds like strictly a professional need, and there's obviously professional interest.
Do you
So
want to
I'm trying
call
to
a
understand
motion?
what our role is as the board to either take ownership of such a movement, or are we here to establish the conversation to allow for a venue for them to then move on into a different direction? Are we going to then open it and lead it and own it? I don't understand, I guess, what the purpose is for establishing the committee unless it's very clear that the end result is, and then what?
Jeff, what was your motion along the same lines to, what was your motion for?
Yes, the establishment of an ad hoc committee to investigate and discuss the benefits to consumer needs by utilization of an apprenticeship program for the purposes of
That's good.
educating and preparing. Period.
Okay.
We need a second.
No.
We need a second.
I might say, I think you said benefits, but I think I would probably word it just as feasibility.
Okay,
If you
fine
think-
with me.
Yeah,
So are you still in the discussion mode, or did you call the motion?
I think he was calling the motion.
Because if you're calling the motion, I need people to outline what that, so can you pull that motion? Can you go back to a discussion,
Sure.
get clearly on the wording, and then we'll call the motion?
So how would you like it? And you can make the
It was
initial motion.
exactly
I'll second.
perfect, just how you would just use feasibility.
Can you read it back to me?
Can you read it back to him?
No, I wasn't sure what it was, so I was gonna ask him to repeat it.
That, you know, that
Explore the
we
feasibility.
We establish an ad hoc committee to work with stakeholders to investigate the feasibility of an apprenticeship program for the purposes of developing
Workforce.
workforce to benefit consumer needs. Does that work?
And protecting consumer safety.
For the occupational therapy assistant, is that what we're
For occupational therapy assistance, yes.
Will you read it back when you are there? And then we'll call us up.
That was a run-on
I had a
sentence.
rough line here, I wasn't sure what this one was. So I believe you moved to establish an ad hoc committee to work with stakeholders to determine the feasibility of establishing an apprenticeship program to develop the workforce for consumer protection and provide consumer safety.
I think it probably
I
should
mixed-
develop
I-
it, yeah.
I missed
I think-
2 words, so I just had a line.
And I think we probably need to say, develop a workforce in the occupational therapy assistant occupation to protect consumers.
And actually, it just needs to be something, if
Just for the OTA is it, for the
That's why I
OTA.
just said that.
just about something about the feasibility, if it's even needed, because we don't want to establish the feasibility, like, yeah, it's gonna work, but we don't need it. You know what I mean?
You know, but Sharon, the establishment of an ad hoc committee that's the purpose of ad hocs. I don't know if we have to.
But
I think it's
I'm
inherent.
with Teresa that it's too broad.
I feel like we've already established the conclusion and now we're just trying to find the need.
Okay.
I mean, that's where I'm
I
struggling with
hear
this.
you.
So I think maybe it's more of an ad hoc committee to explore how best to address the work shortages that will ultimately affect consumer protection. And is this one way to do so, among others? I think that's where I'm struggling. Well, I'm all for, I think this is a great opportunity. I think the program's great. I think it could work. I'm just struggling with what our role is on, have we clearly established that there is a need for which this is the answer?
Okay, so let me ask you this. We didn't have a second on that motion, so the motion died. Motion died, just from a process standpoint.
I love that.
But thanks for repeating it 3 times, Jeff.
Yeah.
Teresa,
It was chuffing.
Teresa, I think you would probably get consensus if you just called a motion and frame. You think you can do that?
Yeah.
Or willing? Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just, my last comment before I make the motion, and I think the conversation is necessary. I feel that there is a need for the conversation. I'm 100% aligned there. I struggle with, and this is the answer. So let's have the conversation to make this the answer.
Explore that as one of many.
So perhaps what I think I hear you saying is that you have the problem with exploring the feasibility of an apprenticeship program because that's the answer.
Right.
And when potentially the bigger question is to explore feasibility of expanding field work
Through an apprenticeship program.
or just field work opportunities for purposes of developing a workforce to meet consumer needs and provide consumer
Then
safety.
Or do you say, how about new and
Thank you.
innovative ways to expand? Because this
They
is
could be
completely different than the
old-
way they
could be
currently.
old and stodgy. I don't.
Well, the only
That's
reason I say is
inherent.
that currently, the only way that this occupation looks at is the way that it's currently structured. So you'd have to say
Where
is
I
that
challenge that. I challenge that because we have a list here that was provided to us of 3 separate apprenticeship programs that are clearly not led by a board. I mean, we have the Kaiser Permanente, the apprenticeship program there. It was established, it was created, it was there, and for all we know, the board does have oversight. My point is, it's been done. So maybe the exploratory conversation is, well, how did they do it? And what was their driving force? And was it professionally driven? And so on and so on. I just think it's premature of us to make assumptions that the only way this is going to happen and this is the only solution. That's
Good
where I
points.
struggle.
All good clarification. Good points. So, the way that the motion was framed, that to explore if it's feasible,
Yeah, so
You re-
I will put forth a motion, the establishment of an ad hoc committee to explore the feasibility of alternate approaches to increase field work sites to address consumer needs due to the shortages of potential, including, this apprenticeship type program. I think that's kind of general, but specific.
Explore the feasibility of alternative
Approaches
approaches.
to increasing the availability of field work sites for our OTs and OTAs, and ultimately address, and the potential impact to consumer
Safety,
protection,
yeah.
consumer safety.
yeah.
That was a motion, yes?
Yes,
And that could also include,
it's a motion.
Who wants to second?
I second.
Seconded by Sharon.
All right.
Discussion?
I think it's interesting too because of the proposals through AOTA to expand, to alter. There's also a discussion on the national level of other alternative models
Correct.
to field work that could be addressed in the ad hoc committee in terms of apprenticeship.
Hopefully they'll be able to bridge those, because right now those only address OTs, not OTs.
True, but could be different paths.
So hopefully there could be a bridge somewhere, sharing
Yes.
information. We need a little more discussion.
Do we have any comments from the public? Mr. Merrill?
If I may, it was brought up about boards in the other occupations were not directly attached to this. In each of those cases, the board had a will to accept the model of education. And in a lot of instances, the board created an apprentice license. So those are just 2 points I wanted you folks to be cognizant of. So it would do no good to create the apprentice program if your board would not accept that as a model that fits. Okay, and that would be with your national and your state stakeholders buy-in. And then whatever levels you folks go to, whether it's going to be your entry level or your, help me out here.
OTA versus
OTA, the OTA, okay. I would urge, if you guys are even considering that, don't shut out your future. So don't say just this one little piece. If you're going to go that far, leave the door open for maybe future development where you may want to do it with your OTs later, okay? You may acquire additional occupation, so don't limit yourself. I see that happen time and time again. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Mr. Merrill. I know that we have had an ongoing about adding athletic trainers too, so that might be an interesting addition in the future as well.
All right, so we have no further public comments, so we need to take roll on that.
Okay, Jeff?
Aye.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Richard?
Yes.
Sharon? Yes.
So do we want to, does the executive director feel like they have enough information from this board on specific themes to address in the ad hoc committee, or would you like us to dialogue?
Nope, I have that.
Okay. You want to just read back a couple of them? Just for 3 of them, top 3?
Well, I do have this nice tape recording and the webcast to go back and capture that. I was really focusing on the motion because I have to do that several times.
So that's a
So I
no.
got that part down. So, I think we're good. Fine.
So that would be a no,
It would be a no.
to go back, the direct request. Okay.
If I mean, I do like the I do like the questions that Mr. Merrill just raised, which are would accepting an apprenticeship and creating an apprenticeship license, would those be some questions, kind of? But I don't know. That's not part of the question.
Did the board
it's
want
not
to put
clear.
some parameters on this
See them.
ad hoc committee? Number of people who, only because it's going to be subject to Bag and Keene, do you want to be able to?
I think those themes came up, Heather. What direction might you go in that as you?
Well, one of the comments that was made earlier was about not understanding the purpose, because what was important to determine if it was something within the board's purview or perhaps something that would be more appropriate for the profession to assume. But obviously it's changed a bit, and these alternate approaches, instead of with an eye towards the apprenticeship piece, it's really looking at the field work or lack thereof, field work sites and the challenges with placing them, and considering an apprenticeship as one of those possible solutions to increase the availability of workforce sites.
So, given that that's the motion, do you see that the tools that the ad hoc committee would use would be comparing existing programs to an existing apprenticeship program that's in the state, or?
I'm not sure because I feel like that's probably a little bit premature.
It sounds exploratory.
It sounds like it
Roundtable
would,
discussion.
yeah, it sounds like it'd be more exploratory, for example, different areas, saying, well, this is what we tried, or this is what could work, have we
And just an
considered?
idea generating session where this is one model you have to look at, maybe they find other models, and then we continue with the discussion.
So I wrote down, just based on
Okay,
Maureen's comment, a couple of the, she wanted to know about who might be on there. So I would imagine, you know, for this to function properly and to have a depth, you know, the type of discussion we need an employer representative, which I don't think we have any employer representatives here today.
We do.
Oh, we did.
She's an employer, but I mean, there are people like her. I don't want to put you on the spot.
National
Alex, right?
Association and State Association representatives. Somebody from DIS to help guide the discussion if there's going to be a discussion about apprenticeship. Somebody from labor, somebody from the board, and somebody from a consumer group, if we can find any, that would have an interest in basically what happens if there's not sufficient field works for people to get trained and there's a shortage of occupational therapists and OTAs. Those are kind of the people that I think would be interesting to be on.
I do want to just go back, since there was some further clarification. My vote stands on the motion for the overall piece, but I just want to be clear, and I'm speaking more as a practitioner. It was not clear to me in the motion that it was not going to include, I thought the exploration was specifically around this tool, because the way I see it as a practitioner is that the National Association, the State Association has exhausted this discussion already. So to have our license board do it is just duplicative work. To have the educators participate in that, they've done that with our National Association, they've done that with the state. Specifically, what is in our area is there's a state organization where there's some legislation on the table, where there's a tool that's used that potentially we can explore if that is a feasible tool for consumer safety, protection of the consumer, and something that we might contribute in terms of the shortage to workforce development. The ad hoc committee, upon exploring that, may say this isn't in the license purview. We like this idea and we're going to take it elsewhere. But to say they're not going to use the tool, I don't see it any different than anything that's been done. I don't think we have this much time to keep talking. I just want my comments noted. My vote can stand. I would have lost by a majority. I just want these comments noted. I would like it
The one reason that I thought it was more important to move towards this as a tool, because I don't know that we are trying to replace the other model. It's trying to be a supplemental model, potentially. It could ultimately become a replacement model if that made sense.
Yeah, I'm happy to
Right?
rescind my motion.
Or
The
they
reason
can,
I
or
think
they
it's
can come
important-
out of the committee and say, we're not using this tool.
The reason
I
that
don't-
it's important
Yeah,
is that, you know, you have a date on some of those other pieces of legislation that are going that would work with this, and it would be a great model for them to look at as they move that piece of legislation, the active date in 2019. Two, we are approaching the states. Currently we have Governor Brown for another year. And we don't know what the next administration will see for funding these. And currently, if this group of stakeholders decided they wanted to explore this and they wanted to get some grant money, they need to be looking at first quarter to be able to start applying for that grant money, I would think. If that is, did Mr.
Well, it
Mayor
sounds
leave?
to me like we've already made a decision that certain members of the board want to have an apprenticeship program, and they want to have a discussion on what
I
that would
don't
look
think
like.
that's my
No.
conclusion.
No, I don't either.
That's not my conclusion.
No, but we do need to move quicker than.
It's the first time as a practitioner that, at least in this area, being on this particular board where there's legislation on the table, it's the first time a group is approached with something that I find to be a feasible tool. Having served on the ad hoc committee for AOTA for fieldwork placement, having been involved in the state discussion, I would fairly say that there are a lot of discussions going on with good solutions, but I haven't seen a tactical tool. I got one today. So for me, my comments aren't intended ever to influence this board. It's the will of the board. I'm speaking more passionately as being a practitioner who's seen this discussion go on far too
Right.
long,
Which
Teresa.
leads credibility
Far
to
too
that it's a
long.
profession-led endeavor.
Well, I think my comments is, there were, in all the discussions occurring, we have a lot. How many thousands of practitioners do we have in the state of California?
Over 18,000.
Okay, so to try to put them in a microcosm of the discussions, there have been patches of those stakeholders. There's a whole other slew of patches of stakeholders that could be brought in on this discussion, which I think the motion doesn't say. It says, let's look at this as a model, and it could be like, this is the model. But it allows for
That
within
it's not the
stakeholder
model.
group to say, it's not the model, and here are some other dialogues. So it doesn't preclude. I have a problem with that just one being assessed because we don't know what their needs
That's
are.
right.
By having open forum discussion, they might be able to say, this is great, and they might decide as a group, as ad hoc, like, let's go with it. But I would like for them to have that power, to
Right.
be open, to be able to have a dialogue on, yes, it's working. I know the timelines, I understand all that, but there's a whole group of stakeholders that have not had a chance to share their voice. So I think the motion for me, I understood it, it kind
Okay.
of opens that up.
Could I-
We're sort of, if I may just comment to that and then
You may.
turn it over to you. We're actually saying the same thing. We're actually saying something more similar than you think we are. It's not that this is the end result. If anybody here in our area legislatively or from the union can tell us of another tool that we can add to the ad hoc committee, I'm all for that as well. I just want the exploration of something that's finally tactical.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been waiting. But, well, I don't want to.
Richard, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Richard, go ahead.
No, I was talking to Noreen.
Okay, so I'm just looking at our pending rulemaking files in process, and I'm looking at how the continuing competency regulation that just took effect October 1st of this month, of this year, was first published in June of 2016. So, Jeff, the timeline you're talking about is, we're not looking at the first quarter of
No.
next year.
No.
So
It's not
I
gonna happen
really don't. We don't have a law that would allow any kind of divergence
True.
from the current structure.
Right.
So,
Right.
so to me, that's the ad hoc committee can look at that
Right.
and to see, should there be a divergence from the structure, what would it look like? I also don't think that, having worked on ad hoc committees with practitioners, that they understand the scope of the board well enough to, I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but I don't think that ad hoc committee members want to do something, they're advocates for, they don't necessarily look at the constraints of the board like board members do.
Right.
Like what is the limit of our discussion? So we need to impose that on the ad hoc committee. Sure.
Well, what I wanted to ask is what if, in terms of giving specificity to the ad hoc committee, what if they were tasked with doing sort of like a crosswalk of what the ACOT requirements are and what the apprenticeship is and how they match and then how they differ, and then also like the pros and cons, like almost like, I don't want to say brainstorming because it sort of belittles the importance of it, but they collect the information, they identify that legislation would need to happen, regulations, do you do a new license type, don't you? I mean, what if they have this very narrow information gathering piece for the recommendation? Because ultimately, all an ad hoc can do is make a recommendation to the board. It's ultimately the board's call. So you need enough information, though, to make a decision, and I feel like if you saw maybe this crosswalk, you would be able to see, is it a professional need or is it something that the board should be?
Right, and so my concern about that is that then all the time spent in ad hoc committee is only exploring this one tool
Can I
or one solution.
make a suggestion that might help resolve this? Is that at this point the board can make a determination, delegate two board members, whoever's interested, to this ad hoc committee. That those two board members can then convene a stakeholder meeting. But the committee are the board members, and those people can make sure that it's the board's priorities and goals, statutory goals that are always kept in mind, and bring those ideas back, rather than a committee that may be more heavily weighted on the profession side. So you're having essentially the same people at the table who can provide those ideas, but the committee itself are board members.
Good point. And so to get to the conclusion, I might throw out a suggestion, since the ad hoc committee may likely consist of many educators. I might suggest that we ask Teresa and we ask Jeff if they'd like to be on that ad hoc committee, because I think the balance and the weight of our two public members who are in opposing ends would probably get us to where we want to be. So, are you so moved, or
I'm fine, I think, but yeah, I've been reappointed.
does the rest of the board?
I will be through December 31st unless otherwise
And
extended.
we'll address it when we had to. Are the practitioner board members okay with that, or does anybody feel so moved? We can't have three, so,
Yeah, you can have 3.
oh,
You can,
Do we
so
need a
at that point, it
practitioner?
will be
Then you notice
something
it.
that- So it's up to you guys.
We notice our committee meetings.
Yeah.
Even if a committee of 2, I mean, we notice them. Although Sharon, I mean, I feel like as an OTA, but also as somebody who's
Yeah.
responsible for locating field work and marketing and
do you want
begging,
to chair?
I just feel like you're need a voice.
Sharon, would you,
Natural,
Sharon,
natural.
Sharon, would you chair that meeting? So the proposal then being put forth is for Sharon to be the chair, our two public members to be on that committee, and then does the board want to identify any other people to be specifically on that committee? Do we have to do that at this meeting, Noreen?
The board has to establish the committee. The president, under the manual, has the authority to appoint people once that committee is established. You've done that, but if you want to be specific, you can. Ms. Martin says that the committee meetings are always noticed anyway, pursuant to bad routine, so it's up to you whether you want to.
Can I ask Noreen a question? So, for example, since she can, once the committee is established properly, and she could add members of the public, we can take nominations of people who may not be here, and then she could, not in the setting of a board, appoint them, or do we have to do the appointment at a board?
She can do the appointment whenever.
There you go, you have flexibility.
It's just whether or not that you want to be clear about how big or small this committee is.
Yeah, I would say not more, I mean, if you want to appoint more people, I would say probably not more than a 5 total, because it becomes very problematic for scheduling purposes.
Right.
5 in addition to the,
No, I mean like these 3 and no more than 2 additional.
That's why.
do we have any members from the public that are here today that would like to participate on our ad hoc? Ada Boone Harrell, Matt Lachey, and we'll appoint one other person, perhaps from Southern California.
Michelle Paralisi indicated she would be available.
Michelle Paralisi, there we go.
That'll be good, because then you'll be able, since they've been appointed, then you can do telephone, have multiple telephone locations and not have to worry about
The
getting
only-
people
Yeah.
to a location.
And the only thing that I would ask of that ad hoc committee is that you provide a vehicle to get feedback back from each of the OTA. Or Heather,
OTA,
however.
educational programs
Mhm.
so reach out specifically to the program directors.
Well, we'll let the ad hoc committee direct you on that, actually. I'll move
Okay.
back. We'll let you guys direct on that, but that would be a wish of mine, that you get input from all. Okay, so there's our ad hoc committee. There's the movement on that.
Before you post, you normally do
Yeah.
a call for comment.
Do we have any further public
Before you
comment
post, you
after,
normally do a call for comment.
No, they can
after our discussion? Chuck, Wilmar.
Again, Chuck Walmart with the American Occupational Therapy Association. I just wanted to clarify in terms of being a member of the ad hoc committee versus a stakeholder. AOT isn't a member of the ad hoc committee, but I think we're an important stakeholder. I just wanted to clarify how we provide input, and I don't think I heard that anyone from OTAC was invited to the ad hoc, so maybe I missed it, but just maybe clarifying the difference between the two.
That's what I just asked him.
Are you on OTAC, Ada? Ada, are you on OTAC?
I'm a member of
Member.
OTAC.
Okay.
That's my role in OTAC.
So your ad hoc committee would include stakeholder input.
But I mean,
Always,
it's
always,
not possible though for Chuck to call in to a teleconference meeting, correct?
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're open.
They're
I
noticed.
mean, well,
Yeah, an open meeting.
It
No.
depends, you can do it a couple different ways. You can provide a public call-in number, or if they, or if there is no public call-in number, a member of the public is entitled to do it at any of the locations that are.
Right, but
noticed
someone in
the-
Washington DC is not gonna fly to California to go to a location for a teleconference meeting.
I
So-
think it's kind of a resource issue about whether or not you have the ability to set up a call-in number.
We haven't in the past.
Haven't set up a call-in number?
No.
We did when you and I met
No.
at your facility and we
You had
had,
to come to my facility.
I chose
Mine
to.
was a registered facility. Mine was a noticed
Oh.
facility.
Okay.
That's,
we're all
and
noticed.
you traveled there.
Okay.
You
Oh,
didn't
you're
call
right.
in from-
Right. Even though there was phone calls from other noticed facilities.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
All of, yeah, and only those facilities.
Okay.
No,
Yeah, you're right.
Let me
It's an
just
administrative
clear it
issue.
up.
Years, this is the first time I'm hearing this.
Okay,
No,
so
let
what's
me
the
be clear.
discussion?
There's a difference between a notice location and a general number for any member of the public to call into. So now a committee or a board member cannot simply call into the public number. They have to be at one of the notice locations.
Right.
But it doesn't prevent the board from providing a general number for participation, not for board members, but for members of the public.
Well,
And
this
then
is
they're
news.
invited to
This is
provide
news to
comments.
us.
This is news,
We
no,
get,
this is news
now that we have
to
a new
me.
council, we have new council. So.
Well, that's pretty witty.
It may just not, the question may not have been asked about whether or not members of the public can call in. If you want to set up, if you have the technology to set up a call-in number for participation,
So there are two differences between what Ileana was telling us before and what you're telling us. One was that you had to name all the ad hoc committee members at the meeting before the committee went, and that's apparently not the case. And now we can have a public call-in number where we can pull people in from other locations. That's totally different. So
For public, not for members.
it may have been how the
So,
question
yeah.
was asked.
Yeah, members
Right,
should not, but
and the way the question is answered. So there.
that's why some people use their home address as their.
But either way, we name the ad hoc committee
I like this answer
And-
better.
I do too.
Yeah.
Let me just say,
But
I like your
either
answer
way,
better.
Noreen, thank you. We've named the ad hoc committee, we voted on that, and we'll look into providing a call-in number.
And there's always opportunity for public members to provide comment. The meetings are posted for ad hoc, and
Yeah.
so either we'll get the number established or the physical sites that we have to be able to participate, but I'm sure letters or other documents would be accepted as well. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, so agenda item 18, discussion on the Accreditation Council for Occupational Therapies Education's proposed amendments. This is the second draft of the A-Code accreditation standards. It was simply for us to have in here to be able to provide comments, have a discussion, have a further resource as it relates to things that we're looking at for shortages of work sites and how that affects workforce development and consumer protection. Do you want to add up anything more, Heather?
No, just that, because they are taking, AOTA is taking input, on these draft guidelines before they vote on them, I just wanted to bring them to your attention so that collectively as a group you could decide if you wanted to weigh in on that individually or as a board.
Anybody have any comments? I was wondering if I might be able to address Chuck Wilmarth, if I could ask the public. I just have a couple of questions of clarification, if I may. So my comments are really just a stylistic thing and nothing more, not related to content, but just to understand. I do plan as a practitioner to provide feedback on its own, so I'm not going to make this a lengthy, let's go through every piece. But is it a fair statement that the the column to the right, the accreditation standards for the associate degree level for the OTA assistant is very similar to the baccalaureate because someday we may be going there as to the baccalaureate being the entry level.
So I'm not the best person to address that. I mean, I just haven't studied it from that perspective. I can tell you about the perspective I have reviewed the standards. And of course, I think the board's aware that there was an announcement, and this announcement was sent out to the different boards, that AOTA or the ACOT would be moving to bachelor's degree entry for 2027. And then just the other day, another announcement came out that said that that decision would be held in advance and that there's a survey that has gone out, and I believe the board also received that or would be receiving it shortly, asking for comments on that. So.
I didn't receive that email. I only received the first one, but okay, this
Yeah,
helps.
that was, let me just double check. I think we send it out to the state regulatory board contacts, and I think there's an information on the website about the decision on abeyance, and then below that it says take this survey, and it's very short. But in terms of comparing the two standards, I just haven't done that.
So,
I'm so
Go
sorry,
ahead.
just for clarification, at the beginning of the guidelines, there is actually a copy from the AOTA website, the call for comments. That's where there is a web-based survey link embedded in the middle, as well as the deadline for the surveys, and also providing the comment for their consideration. So it's at the the page preceding the
Very
guidelines.
first, right behind the blue page.
Yep, and that's copied directly from the AOTA website.
Okay, and just to be clear, there's two surveys. There's the call for comments on these draft standards that is due, but then there's a separate survey asking about the issues related to the move to the baccalaureate degree, and that just came out. So there's two different things.
So, going then to the left column under doctoral, under the preamble, just page 1, I would draw you down to just a couple, and again, this is just a style thing, but it's just a question. Under a graduate from an ACOT accredited doctoral degree level, all of the bullet points are written: have acquired, be educated, have achieved, be prepared to do. Why, as a doctoral level, why wouldn't it just be worded evaluate, educate,
So
articulate, research? Because I'm, as a practitioner, I would just think that an entry-level, doctoral level student would be able to do that. And that's what distinguishes them from the other entry levels.
Okay, I mean, so that's a good point. I would urge that if it's the board's view that that's critical, I urge you to submit comments on that. It's just, I'm not involved in the drafting of
Okay.
these things, that policy staff are asked to review the standards, and do we have suggestions? And so, if it's helpful to you, I can tell you about how I've looked at it. In the sections in B, there's a lot of language there that is related to scope of practice. And so looking at the B standards, and there's a change to modalities under the newest version of the standards that someone will be required to demonstrate electrotherapeutic modalities, which is different than the existing standard. So I've weighed in on the implications of that. The definitions section is critical. So I would encourage you to take a look at the definitions to see how they may impact scope of practice. So that's sort of the lens that I've looked through. I think that's unless you want to talk about specific items and get my thoughts on those, that's about all I can say.
You know, Chuck, I only asked you simply because you're here from AOTA. There's
Okay.
no, and I want to just clarify, I wouldn't be making recommendations as the board. I would make them as an individual practitioner, but for the purposes of the board discussing it, I'm discussing them as an individual practitioner at a board meeting.
Fair enough, and at the same time, the call for comments on the standards did go out to the individual boards. So if individual boards have comments as a board, ACOT would listen to them as an important stakeholder.
Thank you for clarifying that, please.
Chuck, I wonder if you could speak to the relationship of these revisions to the advanced practice requirements in California for hand therapy, swallowing, and physical
somewhat. Okay, first thing that I think you understand is that this document is not the current standards marked up. This is the last draft marked up.
Yeah, I'm
So-
noticing electrotherapeutic modality was added, but it's not underlined, so that must have been the previous draft. Yeah.
Essentially, I mean, I think previously electrotherapeutic modalities was listed, but it was understanding of rather than demonstration of, which is a huge difference. So I think that in terms of the advanced practice requirements in California, I think that if this goes through as is, it's significant in terms of what is required to be demonstrated, not just knowledge and understanding of, but what must be demonstrated in terms of was it deep thermal and electrotherapeutic.
Well, I do see on page 36, 34, this interesting thing under the section on swallowing and under the section on thermal modalities. There's a grayed out line that says the word demonstrate does not require that a student actually perform the task to verify knowledge and understanding. The program may select the types of learning activities and assessments that will indicate compliance with the standard. So it sounds like demonstrate doesn't mean demonstrate to me, but when I read this, so it's interesting that you pointed that out as an important change.
Unless that is
It's
from the
demonstrate
interpretive
knowledge.
guideline portion and it wasn't removed after demonstrate was added to the new standard.
Okay, so I don't quite understand that. I mean, if you're going to demonstrate,
It says demonstrate knowledge, but not necessarily demonstrate. Well, some of them say demonstrate interventions.
okay, so there's.
So some is physical demonstration or actual demonstration versus knowledge of.
Anyway, I mean, just since we've been.
I think, I don't know, when we do competencies, we have to demonstrate verbally and hands-on, and then we have to do the written. So one of those requires, like, you actually demonstrate, but the other one is demonstrate knowledge, just like written.
From time to time, yeah, because from time to time we have people, we take a look at our advanced practice regulations, are they up to date? And, what is the entry level, where is entry level practice? And if entry level practice continues to fall behind our advanced practice standards, then we have to, particularly, we have to keep the advanced practice standards as they are. But if they were to if entry level practice were to approach the advanced practice, then we could take another look at the advanced practice.
Right. So in terms of modalities, I think there are some improvements here. I don't think it's perfect, and I'm confused by how demonstrate is listed here. In terms of hand therapy, I mean, that's just not called out here. I mean, I think you'd probably identify some standards that you could say, well, that's important for hand therapy, but it doesn't. There isn't a standard here that says that, and then there's a very limited standard here. B419, and this is existing, evaluate and provide management of feeding, eating, and swallowing to enable performance, and you could read the rest of it there.
B416 is a little bit in the hand therapy direction on the previous page.
Fair enough. I always,
But they don't call it hand therapy.
right, I always had this, I had the sense from the hand therapy folks that they wanted to see more in the entry-level accreditation standards
sure.
to address upper extremity rehabilitation. So,
Sure, that's true.
and I believe, okay, so that's my response.
So is there, given that thanks Chuck, given,
thank you.
any more questions? Okay, given that we were provided with the option to give feedback as a board, we can either do that or we can have the individual practitioner. Well, let me just ask it differently. Does the board feel so moved that there's items that they want to weigh in on specific to consumer protection? Or do we feel that this is enough of a practice issue that we would have practitioners weigh in independently? I am too. What are you gonna do?
Yeah, the only thing that I think could be appropriate for us to talk about is the demonstrate issue. It would probably be in the consumer's interest if they actually learn how to do the hands-on, but I don't know.
Well, and we're saying something very similar. It's the wording of the action versus the knowledge to. maybe that's our feedback in a general way.
But then, you know, do people get that, does this include the field work component, which does provide some hands-on? And then there are also constraints in the fieldwork settings about what you can do hands-on, what you can't do hands-on. So I don't know if it's appropriate for us to go there or not. But we could certainly make a we could make a comment requesting clarification or something if we, or we could do it as individual practitioners. We could say that we have a question about
So
how
then,
people learn to demonstrate skills.
since we have the opportunity, Jeff and Teresa, to respond as practitioners, I would ask you both if you feel so moved that you would like us to weigh in as a board, since you're.
Yeah, I'm completely supportive of the board's direction from a practitioner standpoint and with supporting recommendations of the board, as a board. I think that as a public member, it's strictly language to me, although I do recognize 100% that demonstrate needs, that type of thing needs to be very specific, whether it's demonstrate verbally, demonstrate written, demonstrate in action. So I would be supportive of that.
It's the exact same thing, you know, it's like we're not in a position as practitioners to understand and make comment on that. We defer to you folks, but as a board member, I'd want to have clarity on what demonstrate.
So if there's further discussion with the executive director and we feel so moved to send that one comment forward, are we for that, or do we want?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you feel like you have enough direction on that, or?
I would probably need a little bit more information in order to submit something in writing on behalf of this board. I mean, I'm not a practitioner, so I feel
We'll
like
provide
bring
you
a
one or
certain
two
lens.
examples.
Well, I have a move. I can make a motion.
Yeah.
I would just make a. I would move that the board comment to ACOTE concern about the section where it says the word demonstrate does not require the student actually perform the task to verify knowledge, and how that may, how that level of training protects the consumer.
Right here.
So is that a question or some?
You might be able to.
Please
It's a
clarify,
comment. It's a
please
comment.
clarify
Okay.
how this section in the standards protects the consumer.
Okay.
That's the question.
Versus,
I think,
something.
And then that's gonna encompass, and then individually as practitioners, if we get into the specifics of it, I think collectively between both of those, we're gonna get
I
to,
mean, I think I might know what they might say, but I would like to know what they would say.
yeah,
And we're not in that.
And
that's, that's
this
all.
is
That
the
would be-
page it's
Call for
on.
comment. Yep, I have
it's
it
right
written down.
below B
Yep.
420.
But with the call for comment, you know, you may not get a written response.
That's fine.
She believes she'll be done by then.
And I think if you're 5 minutes late, it turn into a pumpkin.
They're already at the extra hour.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So do you want me to?
We made the motion, there was no second. I'll second.
Aye.
Yes.
I have to go to discussion first, I believe.
Ah.
Any discussion from the public on what we've just decided to do as a board? Yes,
May I call attention to another item for consideration?
sure. We will take a short break after.
Again, Ada Boone Hurl, Sacramento City College Program Director. I would like to call attention in the right-hand column for the education for the OT assistant, items C.18 and C.19. Actually looking at C19 first, in that this is referring to field work in and addressing some of the national concern related to what we've been discussing earlier today, access to fieldwork sites. And so this is showing different methods that level 1 fieldwork is going to be addressed in terms of, by one intention, to reduce some of the impact on fieldwork sites. the concern I have that I'd like to share, related to, the change is, if you'll look at actually it's just related to C.19. I'm sorry, it was in two different boxes. Here's the problem. Document that a maximum is, based on the current proposal, a maximum of 40 hours of level 1 fieldwork experiences are provided to students. And it is, and as an educator's viewpoint, that is a very low number for level 1 fieldwork. And to me, that I see as a consumer protection issue because of the developmental nature of education and being able to understand populations, and in addition to the treatment techniques required. By maxing us at 40 hours, we will then only be giving probably 10 or 12 hours to physical disabilities in level 1 fieldwork, 10 or 12 hours to psychosocial concerns, and possibly 8 to 10 in pediatric populations for level 1 fieldwork. To me, that I would like to point out as something I believe is a potential consumer protection issue and a concern that we will be responding to in call for feedback. Thank you.
Please. Can you go to the, I was on the ad hoc committee and I know why that was done, so I would not want to be the one presenting that.
Okay.
Can you present it? Do you?
I just wanted to point out under the new standards for the baccalaureate and OTD fieldwork requirements in standard number D.1.5, they have a 6-week or 240-hour minimum for a level 2 fieldwork for the OTAs, and a 560-hour one for the doctoral. So I mean that's significantly lower than what the current. Speaking of that.
Good point for the ad hoc committee
Yeah.
to take that into consideration.
Oh, the fieldwork, the alternative models.
Okay, so we have public comment, we have a motion, we need to take roll.
Aye.
Yes.
Yes. Can we make another motion? To make a comment about this maximum and how does that protect the consumer?
Right.
Hold on a second, I need, Heather has to take notes on this. Do you know there's another motion which would be included in your letter of direction from the board?
Okay.
Specifically, go ahead.
In section C.1.9, how does imposing a maximum to the level 1
Maximum.
field experience protect the consumer? Does it represent a reduction in training to cap it?
And that would actually be for all of them,
And what was the last thing you said? I'm sorry.
Anything?
No, before that.
to cap it.
How does a
Reduction.
maximum?
It's a reduction of training.
Oh, reduction. That was what it is.
Reduction in training, protect the workforce, consumer safety.
And I would just ask that, like President Miller mentioned, is that if there were other, rather than saying specifically that one is the only one we look at, is that if there are any maximums in training, that we have a concern on how that improves. Example being 3.1. You could usually call it out at that, but
I second the motion to amend.
To use the word maximum instead of hours, right?
Yeah.
no, rather than referencing it as
Rather than that section.
section, we use that section as a example versus a question directly to
Because other areas have maximums.
potential. Yes.
I know.
So first we vote on the amendment, then we vote on the motion.
Can we, just 1 second, just let me can we go forward on the motion, or do we need to pull back on the motion, take a break? I just need guidance on which direction to go.
My preference is to take a break.
And can we actually take a break in the middle of a motion? Or do I need them to rescind the motion so we can take a break?
Take a break.
Okay, we are going to take, how long, Noreen? 1 o'clock?
10 minutes.
Sure.
Well, I thought you
We're-
wanted to go check out too. You
I
can
am.
do too.
Okay. We are going to, just for the purposes of the public, we are taking a break until 1 o'clock. The time is 1:14. Thank you. We're back together. We are on agenda item 18. Discussion on the Accreditation Council for the proposed amendments. We do have a motion that, if you could please restate it, Richard, so that we could vote on it. We will then move forward on the agenda.
Well, I made a motion and then she seconded it, and then Jeff had an amendment.
Friendly
which-
amendment to the.
Friendly amendment, which I think Teresa seconded. Do you have all of that?
That was before you went to
No.
comment.
Do you want to you want us to
No.
redo it?
Yeah.
Just
I-
restate it.
Just like every.
Okay, so,
Wait up, first of all, I can rescind mine, he can rescind his and then restate a new one.
Yeah, that's a good
Sure,
idea.
let's do
That's a
that.
good idea.
Let's do that.
So I'm gonna rescind my motion to amend the initial motion. Who does my second?
I'll rescind my second.
What's that?
We didn't vote.
But the first one.
Remember you broke.
We never.
No,
there was
what
another one.
happened is there was a motion, there was discussion, you don't have to do anything because yours was discussion about rescinding. It's Richard who has to just rescind the original motion and we'll start all over again.
The motion that's already been voted.
No,
It
we're not.
hasn't been
there
We didn't
was a-
vote on it.
There was
The
a,
very first one wasn't?
No,
No.
no, that's why I asked
thought
you if
there
we
was-
could
very
break in the
first
middle
one
of a
that one was
motion.
actually voted and we're not changing that one. There's
Oh, okay.
actually two motions on this item.
Yeah.
There's a motion about one
The very
section.
first one is in place, it's
Yes.
still in
Right.
effect.
And this
Okay.
second one, that's why, yeah.
That's fine.
Or do you feel,
I do.
yeah,
I would like
Thanks.
to, I move to ask ACOT how imposing a maximum on hours of fieldwork experiences protects the consumer.
You've used an example. For example,
Ensures
in,
adequate training.
For example, section C.1.9, for maximum, imposing a maximum on the level one experiences for OTAs
we were gonna keep it,
and OTs,
right,
for example.
for example.
I'll second the motion.
Any discussion? Any public comments? Okay, if we could take roll on that motion?
Aye.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great work. Moving on to agenda item number 19, licensing and enforcement data and reports for the quarter ending September 30th, 2017.
So you have before you the information for the first quarter of the fiscal year. Based on some anomalies that were reported at the last meeting, one of the questions had to do with more specific data. And Qbert, which is an IBM Cognos product, it has like quality, business, interactive reporting tool, I believe. They're actually building a Qbert report to pull out some of the data relative to the applications that we can't get. So some of this high-level data is standard amongst all the boards, and then we have these Qbert reports that are developed that so we can drill down or get different data. So any questions? So that's the licensing data.
Hold on, I
Application
did.
received, Applications received and then approved, and remember, like, it can be received on the 30th of the month, but maybe it's approved on the 10th of the following month, and so it's not, that's why the approved numbers don't equal the received numbers. Or maybe an application was received September 2nd, but it's not going to be approved until they take and pass the exam in November, for example. So it's not even always the next month. They have up to 2 years to complete the application, meet all the minimum qualifications, or else the application is abandoned. So oftentimes they're just not approved in the same month that they're received. Any questions? So the enforcement data is before you, including complaints received, complaints closed. There's been a huge traction in the last 6 months and closing some of the pending complaints, so really reducing some of that backlog. But as a result of that, you can see 25 cases at the AG's office. So I've been with this board for 12 years, and we've never had this many at one time. I also believe we have, you'll see on the next reporting period, because we have some other ones that are getting ready to go over. So the likelihood is you're going to have a very busy year next year with discipline as these cases come. On the back side of that information, one statement of issues filed, only one petition to revoke probation, and then of course the information on the final decisions that you had previously voted on. Any questions?
Can you move right into your executive report from here? Yeah, I will.
And then we have the citation data. The number of citations is actually minimal this quarter. A lot of time was being spent on those cases that were being referred to the AG's office for formal discipline. And then lastly, the standard list of who's currently on probation is provided. Any questions?
So before we move on to the executive director's report, are there any questions from the public? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to your report, agenda item 20.
Okay. I'm not going to read to you, but in a nutshell, we typically have both revenue and expenditure information, and with moving to the new fiscal system, and the department has to balance the books. They are working on that, and they anticipate in late October, early November, July will be balanced, and then once that's kind of in the stumbling block, then it will be more quickly to balance the other past months. So I won't have any revenue or expenditure information available until the February meeting. Of note, though, is that the board is looking for new office space. Our current location does not have enough room for the number of cubicles, for the number of positions that we have. And so we had actually set aside money last year, out of last year's budget, and saved it for this year to do construction to remove a wall and annex what is currently a conference room, annex it into our location, and then build it out. And instead we're looking at a new location, which for those of you familiar with where the office is in Sacramento, we're west of the 80 freeway. The new office we're looking at is east of 80, it's actually past the Arden Fair Mall. And so there's a large space there. There's several other tenants at the current building that are also possibly considering moving, but the building management is offering very generous tenant improvement costs. Whereas our budget was going to pay for the construction to annex the space, and instead, because the new new building owner will cover those costs, instead we're going to take that money and actually use it for cubicles, which we are required to buy them from the Prison Industry Authority, and they are $5,000 a piece. So it's a lot of money. So I'll have more information to report. I don't think the board will move until between January and March of 2019, but we've started the process. Any questions about that?
Yeah, for such a move like that, the administrative costs, considering it's personnel, is that absorbed by DCA or is that absorbed by the board?
It's absorbed by the board.
So any kind of IT movement, mailing, change of addresses, the physical movement as well would all be?
Correct. So for the IT though, we're actually the assigned project manager for our move. He's looking into that because he believes that DCA's OIS covers the IT costs related to the move, related to the purchasing of the servers. And then their help desk is the ones that come and like move the computers, et cetera. Well, we have professional movers, but I mean, they come do parts.
Yeah, because professional move costs can be quite expensive.
Well, the good news is we're going, I think, 1.6 miles away, so the cost shouldn't be too much. When we moved within our current building, we moved from one end down to the other end. Board stepped a lot of the packing, so that the movers just did the moving piece, and that's probably we'll be doing that again. I can't fill positions actually because I don't have space for them.
Understood. I guess I'm looking at it from just a cost perspective because you indicated that there were other tenants within your building that were considering moving.
Mhm.
Would that not free up space existing where you're currently at then?
No, at this point, no board larger than us. Like we've been having on recurring meetings, and so at the handout at the last meeting was they identified the board and the amount of square feet and ranked them smallest to largest. So, for example, when we move, another smaller board that needs bigger space may move into our space. So there are some, cost savings with the backfilling, but unless one of the four boards larger than us move, we have nowhere to go.
How about the cost per square foot versus what we currently pay per square foot?
So the current cost per square foot is $1.70. Depending on the TIs that the boards collectively hope for, they're going to have to negotiate a new rate. And at the new location, it will be the $1.70 with no rate increase. So in addition to keeping what our current rental rate is now, rather than this unknown increase, that's one benefit. And the TI cost, they're offering $55 a square foot. It's really considerable. I don't think it's going to take a couple $100,000 to build out a space. We use generic indoor-outdoor carpet. We have 2 shades of paint. LED lights will probably be more expensive than the paint.
Right.
But,
Yeah, I would only caution on that assumption. As you were aware, I owned a franchise and I was building out a small studio, and my costs were about $60,000 on 1,000 square feet, and that was just TI stuff. So it can very easily run into several $100,000. It's a much larger building, with permitting, construction, and everything else. So I would just be very clear on what the costs actually are.
Yeah, the project manager agrees that it will not cost that much. So that's not just my personal opinion. I have to base that on something. Because that was one thing, I had to consider that. Because I said, in addition to that, if we have to have TI costs plus the cost of the cubicles, it's cost prohibitive. Any more questions? Okay, so regarding the communications update, the one thing is the board's strategic plan had talked about increasing the social media presence, and so I'm showing here the increases in the likes and/or followers so you can see where it is increasing, so that's good. In regards to the suggestion about the board establishing a LinkedIn account, I worked with the public affairs and person assigned to our board, and since neither she nor I have a LinkedIn account, we can't go in and set up the board one, so we're exploring what other options are regarding that. So it's not been resolved yet, but it's also not falling off the radar. Also regarding the committees, I wanted to let everyone know that the board does have a booth at the OTAC conference, so Jeff and I will be there Friday during the expo, and then again on Saturday. And with an eye towards the fact that the board needs to staff some of the committees, the committee document that's included in your materials that includes an overview of the committees, that will be available at our booth. So there's a chart showing it, and then there's 2 pages describing the committees. So again, we're just trying to leverage these communication opportunities. Also, one of the things we talked about is sending out a survey monkey to the schools regarding the payment for the placement at the fieldwork sites. And the Solid Good group put together for me a draft of those questions, and I will be asking some of the educators for some feedback. I believe there's 5 questions asking for some feedback before it's sent out, so I'll be able to report back on what the educators' responses are at the February meeting. And then also what we're going to do is with the concerns surrounding the license renewal fee increases and the board's expenditures, one of the topics that came up both as a proposed regulation as well as a legislative change is the concept of charging probationers for their probation monitoring costs. You may recall that I can't remember if it was earlier this year or late last year, but the board spends well over $100,000 a year on probation monitoring costs. And so with an eye towards the fact that the increased discipline and increased enforcement staff was part of the driver of the fact that the board needed a fee increase, basically Solid staff is working on that. I'm not sure if it would be 1 question or 2, but to get the pulse of the profession. For example, do they want to see the probationers pay the probation monitoring costs because they're the ones who are on probation for wrongdoing? Or does the profession think as a whole they should share in that cost with an understanding that it could result in a renewal fee increase again? I mean, like we already have one slated for 2021, but if the discipline continues to go up and more people are placed on probation, there's costs surrounding that. So we're hoping to have that. Jeff and I will both have our laptops available. Again, it's 1 or 2 questions. As people stop by the booth to ask questions, we'll point them to it and ask if they'll have an opportunity. The Solid staff assured me that they can change the settings so that multiple people can submit responses from the same device, but then should we choose to send it out to everyone on the listserv and the interested parties, for example, then they change the settings so that it's only a unique user can do it. I can't sit at my home and respond 29 times what my answer is. So it's nice to know that those safeguards are in place. Any questions? I'll just keep going. So,
I have a question that raises a question, but the people on probation now, the number of people on probation, there's an upward curve, upward trend in the number of people on probation? Or
it's been pretty consistent. I don't, like 5%, I don't feel it's like an anomaly, but with 25 cases at the AG's office right now and more going.
Right. It's the AG's office more than that.
As well as you had 2 reinstatement hearings at this meeting. There's 2 scheduled for February. Several other people who were previously revoked will then be eligible. We don't know if they will or not, but again, with an eye towards that is an increase, a potential future increase in probationers that we're needing to kind of keep aware of.
It's not actual, but it's a potential.
Correct.
It's good given the AG backlog. Okay, thank you.
And so in terms of freeze, for those if anyone in this room as a licensee has renewed since August, can you hold up the board now has the card printer working. Board staff are part of the breeze. One of the breeze fixes was to turn off the automation of the printing of the licenses. For people who don't know, it was a sheet of green paper with a dotted line and a little symbol of a scissors saying "cut here," and you were supposed to cut your paper license off of a large sheet of paper. So that was turned off, And so now we have these batch reports, and so for license renewals, duplicate license requests, initial licenses, these folks will get this type of card. And part of that other fix was we also turned off printing of the inactive licenses, because again, if you're not practicing, why do you need that license? And also in response to board direction previously regarding the high number of applicants who are submitting applications and not paying the application processing fee. One, that while we couldn't change the functionality to pay first, what we're doing as an interim step is we're adding a kill question at the beginning. It's only yes, no. It's if I proceed, I understand I will have to pay a $50 application fee with a credit card. Yes, no. Now, it's called a kill question because if they click no, they don't get to go on. And if they do click yes, they get to go through the process, but there's still that risk of them not going through and making the payment. So, baby steps. Any questions? There are a number of future agenda items on here. And so also I would add to this was the schools survey, and then the decision at the last meeting to have considering of a new logo for the board at a future meeting. These are not in order. They're simply numbered to keep track of them and not priority.
Could
So-
I
Yes.
just suggest that if we're going to look at PDUs in person versus online technological, that perhaps we include the exploration in there to include virtual reality means?
Okay. So then at the bottom under other informational items, this was sort of a way for me to bring this back to you, items you've asked about. So again, the committee information is here. The letter to St. Catherine's, thanking them for their letter to the board is in here. We also have some process diagrams for both the complaint process as well as the advanced practice and the application process. Following that is an application for initial license checklist that was actually taken by Jeff when he went to Sacramento City College, I believe in September. We thought it was a good opportunity to have those students field test this and let us know, which was a part of the board's strategic plan, but get feedback regarding, how helpful is it? And unfortunately, because they're not graduating yet, that our timing was off for that. So what we're hoping to do is field test it with some new graduates and be able to report back on that at the February meeting. And that concludes my report, unless anyone has any questions.
I like the letter that you sent to Diane Anderson at St. Catherine, the use of the word commingle, good use of the word commingle.
That was Jeff. He did a good job.
Good job, Jeff.
Co-mingler.
Any comments from the board? Any feedback from the public, comments? Okay, seeing none. Although our schedule has us going into closed session and then reconvening to go into items 22 and 23, I'd like to go ahead and move those two items up and then have us convene into closed session so that our public does not have to come back or wait. Anybody opposed?
Nope.
All right. So let's go to item 22 for suggested items for a future meeting. Well, there would be a report of an ad hoc, from the ad hoc.
And then we have the things that are already on the list, right?
Yep.
It's enough for me.
So you would prioritize those? Right. Yeah. Okay. Any comments from the public on future agenda items? Great. Okay. Item 23, election of officers. We're going to come back to closed session. I thought in the interest of the public not having to come back, that we might go ahead and elect our officers. Now, the direction that we go on this is that we open it up for nominations and we vote.
I'll make a motion that we keep the existing officers if they're so willing to choose in the current positions. For nomination.
No, it's very, I can make a motion, right?
For nomination.
Yeah. I appreciate that. It's been an honor. It's been a complete honor to, first of all, be a board member and be appointed by the governor. And secondly, to be a board member on this board and to have held the helm and have been a leader for 3 years. I continue, and we're all leaders, but I think it's just been one of the most satisfying aspects of my career. That being said, I think that it's time for us to bring in all the other talent that we have around the room, and I'm going to make a motion to nominate Richard Bookwater for president.
I'll second that.
Look at his face, like he's like, I'm not sure if I like this. Does Jeff's motion die for lack of a second?
Jeff's motion died for lack of a second, correct? That was the discussion on it. No one seconded that. Thanks for, I'm going to go forward and make a motion that we nominate Richard Bookwater for president.
So it's a nomination.
Nomination.
You're nominating Jeff, and then there'd be a motion.
No, it's my last executive move. He is the president. No, I'm kidding. All right. It's a motion that we nominate Richard. Can you let's do the whole slate.
Discussion. Okay.
Do you want to discuss it?
Well, I haven't been reappointed, so that is, we should just at least throw that. I mean, I've been reappointed for next year, but if, so there maybe needs to be a new election if I'm not. But I have applied, so it may be possible. that
So
I'm
be it.
reappointed.
Any thoughts on that, Laura?
Before people vote.
I agree. We can always do, if for some strange reason that fell through, then we would just deal with it then. But I'm assuming that you're going to get reappointed and it's all good, so.
Either way, you're a winner. You're a president for 2 months.
Queen for a day.
And either way, we're all winners if you're president for, either way, we can't lose as a board with
But
that.
just to be clear, this is for calendar year 2018, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
This is for calendar year 2018.
So maybe not Queen for a day.
Okay. And we'll address it coming back in February if we have to, but let's just assume everyone's going to be appointed in that nomination. Noreen, can we take the entire slate and then vote on it, or do we have to,
If you so choose, unless there's more than one nomination for each office. So you really need to open it up for nominations for president, open it up for
Any
nominations
other-
for vice chair.
any other nominations for president? How about vice president?
I nominate Sharon for vice president.
I'll second.
And I'm nominating Laura for secretary.
Second.
So those are the three roles that we need elections on, right? So what we're putting forth as the nominating slate is Richard Bookwater for president, Sharon Pavlovich for vice president, and Laura Haith for secretary.
So you want to ask 3 times, are there any other nominations? You will want to do that.
Yeah, are there any other nominations? Okay,
Now you can vote on it as a slate if you like.
so who wants to put the motion forward as a slate?
Okay, so then, because there was Laura seconded earlier when you nominated Richard, but now you're doing a new one. So just new.
Well, and
slate.
then he
seconded
seconded it for her, so
She then
I
nominated
seconded
them.
it for her.
Just nominations, not
we,
motions.
It's very
So
confusing.
we have three motions.
No, let me
No, they
just,
weren't motions.
let's, they weren't motions, let's just take it back, even though you used that wording.
Right.
I did preface that we were in discussion, I did ask our legal if we could do it as a slate, so for clarification, it's a slate that the motion, and we now need a motion for that slate.
So to
Okay.
clarify, there was a nomination for Richard for president, Sharon for vice president, Laura for secretary. Now there's a motion to vote on that slate.
Yes.
Correct.
I have a question. If there's no other nominees, is it not by acclamation if they just accept?
No, we still have to move to
Do you-
adopt that.
do you
The
still
board
have
has
to
to move
adopt?
to adopt that slate.
There may be no other nominations, but there may be people who still vote no.
Okay.
So we need a motion. And if
You
you
gotta
could
call the
preface
roll.
it as a 2018. No, we need the
Motion?
motion. We need the motion in
I
a
make a
second.
motion that we adopt the nominations of Richard Bookwalter as president, Sharon Pavlich.
That's that last name,
Pavlovich,
right?
Yes, as vice president, and Laura Haith as recorder
For 20.
for 2018.
I'll second.
Great.
Okay, Jeff,
Aye.
Laura,
Yes.
Teresa,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes,
Richard,
Yes.
Sharon, yes.
congratulations. How lucky we are to have so many good board members to pull from. I thought that I was done as soon as those elections happened, but I obviously am through December, so.
Hey, you're stuck.
Not that I don't, I certainly don't mind, but I was laughing because I was hoping you would take us to closed session. So that, knowing what's doing, since I've done 4 of them.
I never liked
Oh, okay, so that being said, any comments from the public? All right, this at 1:45 PM on Thursday, October 19th, this concludes the open session for the California Board of Occupational Therapy in Sacramento, California. We are now reconvening into closed session.